The late afternoon sun dipped behind the dense treetops of Acadia National Park, casting long shadows across the manger station. The air was crisp, laced with the scent of pine and damp earth, signaling that nightfall was fast approaching. Inside the wooden cabin that served as the park's central hub, I sat at a worn desk, finishing a routine report on trail conditions. My hand paused mid-sentence as I glanced out the window, watching the creeping fog roll in from the coastline like a ghostly tide. There was always something unsettling about this time of year. With summer long gone and most tourists deterred by the colder weather, the park felt emptier, quieter, as though it were holding its breath. I'd been a park ranger here for over a decade, yet the eerie silence of late autumn never failed to put me on edge. The crackle of static from the radio on my desk snapped me out of my thoughts. I leaned forward, adjusting the dial until the voice on the other end came through clearly. It was one of the seasonal volunteers stationed near the park's entrance. "Ranger Carrington, this is Base 1. We've got an emergency. Ever." My stomach tightened. Emergencies this late in the day were never simple. "Base 1, this is Carrington. What's the situation? Ever." "We've got a missing child, 6-year-old boy named Tommy. He was last seen near the start of the old timber trail. His parents reported him missing about 10 minutes ago. They're pretty shaken up." The volunteer's voice carried an edge of concern, as though he knew the odds were already stacking against us. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. The old timber trail was a narrow, winding path that led deep into the heart of the park, surrounded by dense forest and steep inclines. Even during the day, it was easy to lose one's bearings out there. At night, with the fog closing in, it became a labyrinth. "Understood. Keep them at the station and I'll head out. Contact the other rangers and tell them to be on standby. I'll radio in with updates. Over and out." I stood, my mind already racing through the steps I needed to take. Grabbing my flashlight, thermal blanket, and first aid kit, I stuffed them into my backpack with practiced efficiency. I clipped my radio to my belt and soldered the pack before stepping outside. The cold hit me immediately, biting through my thick jacket. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Finding lost hikers or campers was part of the job, but children were different. They were smaller, more vulnerable, and far less predictable. The thought of a 6-year-old alone in these woods as night fell sent a ripple of unease through me. I started down the gravel path that led to the old timber trail, my boots crunching rhythmically against the ground. The fog was thicker here, swirling around the tree trunks like pale tendrils. The towering pines loomed overhead, their dark silhouettes blending with the dimming sky. The forest was growing darker by the minute, shadows lengthening and merging into an impenetrable gloom. I flicked on my flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through the fog but barely illuminating more than a few feet ahead. I scanned the ground carefully as I walked, searching for any sign of recent movement. A footprint, a broken branch, anything that might indicate where the boy had gone. A faint breeze rustled the leaves above, making the forest whisper with a voice all its own. I had always been attuned to the subtle sounds of the wild, the rustle of animals in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl. But tonight, something felt different. The usual forest noises seemed muted, swallowed by the encroaching fog. Even the wind seemed hesitant, as though reluctant to disturb the stillness. My radio crackled again. I stopped and unhooked it from my belt. "Carrington, this is Base 1. Just got word from the boy's parents. He was wearing a red jacket and jeans when they last saw him." "Ever. Red jacket. Got it. I'm on the trail now. I'll keep you updated. Over and out." I clipped the radio back onto my belt and continued walking. A red jacket would stand out against the browns and greens of the forest floor, making it easier to spot in the dim light. Assuming the boy hadn't wandered too far, I quickened my pace, every second feeling heavier with the weight of urgency. Memories of another search and rescue mission surfaced, one that hadn't ended well. A chill ran down my spine as I pushed the thought away. This wasn't the time to dwell on past failures. The trail narrowed, flanked by thick underbrush and gnarled roots that twisted across the path like skeletal fingers. I slowed, shining my flashlight from side to side. My heart pounded steadily in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. Then I saw it, a small footprint pressed into the soft earth. I knelt down, examining it closely. It was fresh, likely made within the last hour. My breath fogged in the cold air as I stood, scanning the area for more tracks. "Tommy," I called out, my voice carrying through the stillness. It sounded too loud, almost intrusive, in the heavy silence. I waited, listening intently. Nothing. Straightening, I swept my flashlight beam over the trees ahead. Somewhere out there, a frightened child was waiting to be found, or worse, wandering deeper into the forest, away from safety. And with night falling fast, the odds were turning grim. "Hang in there, kid," I muttered to myself as I pressed forward, disappearing into the fog-draped woods. The fog thickened with every step I took, wrapping itself around the forest like a shroud. My flashlight barely cut through the swirling gray mist, its beam reduced to a faint glow against the oppressive darkness. The trail beneath my boots was slick with fallen leaves, damp from the moisture clinging to the air. Each crunching step echoed unnaturally loud, as if the forest had grown even quieter in response to my presence. I couldn't help but glance around constantly. The trees were towering sentinels, their twisted branches clawing toward the sky, and the fog made them seem as though they were leaning in closer. It felt as if I had entered a different world, one where time didn't move quite right and shadows watched from just beyond the edge of sight. "Tommy," I called out again, my voice sounding more uncertain now. The stillness that followed gnawed at my nerves. I knew the forest well, too well, and this part of the trail wasn't known for anything unusual. Yet tonight, everything felt wrong. There was no response, but I hadn't expected one. 6-year-olds didn't tend to answer when they were scared. If he was lost, he was probably curled up somewhere, too frightened to move. I just had to find him before the cold got worse. I pressed on, my fingers tightening around the flashlight. The radio at my belt crackled briefly, then went silent. I paused, hoping for a transmission, but all I heard was the soft hiss of static. Maybe the fog was interfering with the signal, or maybe I was just too deep into the woods for it to reach base 1 clearly. I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing unease in my chest. It wasn't the first time I had been out in these woods alone at night, but something about tonight felt heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. A flicker of red caught my eye, and my heart leapt into my throat. I stopped dead in my tracks, shining the flashlight toward the spot where I thought I saw the color. There it was again, a faint glimpse of something red, partially obscured by a thick patch of underbrush. "Tommy," I called out, keeping my voice calm, though my pulse was racing. I pushed through the underbrush, the branches scratching against my jacket. My boots sank slightly into the soft earth as I moved closer to where I'd seen the color. But when I reached the spot, there was nothing there. Just a few red leaves clinging to a low-hanging branch. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay focused. False alarms were common in search and rescue missions. Your mind starts playing tricks on you when the stakes are high and the stress even higher. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The fog seemed thicker here, swirling around my legs in dense, coiling patterns. I turned in a slow circle, sweeping my flashlight across the trees. Shadows danced at the edges of the beam, shifting and stretching in ways that made my skin crawl. I've always believed that fear is like a seed. Start small, just a faint twinge at the back of your mind. But if you let it take root, it grows. And right now, that seed was starting to sprout. I pulled out my radio again and tried to hail base 1. "Carrington to base 1, do you copy?" "Eva." Only static answered me. I frowned, glancing back in the direction I had come from. I could barely make out the trail through the fog, but I knew I hadn't wandered too far off course. I had to keep moving. Turning back now wasn't an option. Not until I found Tommy. Carrington to any available ranger. Do you copy? Over. I tried again, keeping my voice steady despite the rising tension. Still nothing. The fog was messing with the signal, or maybe there was some kind of interference. For a moment, I stood there, listening to the static hum from the radio. And then, just faintly, I thought I heard something beneath it. A soft sound, almost like whispering. I jerked my head up, shining the flashlight in a wide arc around me. The forest was still, silent except for the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze. But that whispering, it had sounded close, too close. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep moving. The fog seemed to press in tighter around me, each step feeling heavier than the last. My breath came out in short, visible puffs, and I tried to focus on the task at hand. Find Tommy, get him out of here, and figure out what the hell was going on later. Another few minutes passed in tense silence. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional crackle from my radio. But then, just as I was starting to think the whispering had been my imagination, I heard it again. This time it was clearer. Help! I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was faint, barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakable. It had come from somewhere up ahead, deeper into the woods. Tommy, I called, taking a cautious step forward. Is that you? No answer. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me that something wasn't right. But I couldn't ignore the possibility that it really was the boy. If he was hurt, he might not be able to call out loudly. He could be lying just beyond the next bend, waiting for someone to find him. Gritting my teeth, I pushed forward, the flashlight beam bobbing slightly with each step. The fog was so thick now that it felt like walking through a dream or a nightmare. The trees loomed larger, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes by the pale light. Help? Trees. The voice was closer this time, but it didn't sound quite right. There was something off about it, something I couldn't put my finger on. I stopped again, shining the flashlight ahead. The beam caught on something moving just at the edge of my vision. But when I turned to focus on it, there was nothing there. My grip tightened on the flashlight. I took another deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. This was just the forest playing tricks on me, I told myself. The fog, the darkness, the tension, it was all combining to mess with my senses. But as I stood there, listening to the whispering fade into silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I didn't move for a moment, rooted to the spot by an overwhelming sense of unease. The fog around me shifted like it had a life of its own, curling and swirling as if trying to swallow the trees whole. The air felt heavy, dense with moisture and something else, something I couldn't quite name. It was the kind of stillness that made your instincts flare, like a primal warning from somewhere deep in your gut. Tommy, I tried again, my voice quieter this time. It felt wrong to speak too loudly, as if I might disturb something I didn't fully understand. Silence. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep walking. Each step felt deliberate, the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots sounding unnaturally loud. My flashlight beam swept back and forth across the forest floor, revealing nothing but tangled roots and scattered pine needles. Then, just ahead, I spotted something, a disturbance in the underbrush. I moved closer, kneeling to examine it. The bushes had been pushed aside, as if something small had passed through recently. My heart rate quickened. This has to be Tommy's trail, I muttered under my breath. But even as I said it, doubt crept in. The trail was too erratic, too wild. It didn't look like the careful path a child might take, even if he was frightened. The underbrush was trampled in strange patterns, almost like something had been circling. I shook off the thought. This wasn't the time to let my imagination get the better of me. Standing, I pulled out my radio and tried again. Carrington to base 1. I think I found a trail. Looks recent. Eva. Static. I waited, but there was no response, just that faint hissing crackle. I sighed, clipping the radio back to my belt. The fog was likely messing with the signal, but it didn't make me feel any less alone. As I continued along the faint trail, I noticed the temperature seemed to drop even further. My breath came out in thick, white puffs, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches interlocking above me like a skeletal canopy. It was darker here, the fog thickening into an almost tangible wall. Then I saw it, a small footprint pressed into the soft earth. I note again, shining my flashlight directly onto it. It was fresh, too fresh. My pulse quickened as I traced the outline with my eyes. The print was small enough to belong to a child, likely Tommy. Relief mingled with anxiety as I stood, scanning the surrounding area. "I'm close," I whispered to myself. "Just hang on, kid." I followed the trail carefully, moving slower now. The footprints were scattered, appearing every few steps, as if Tommy had been running or stumbling through the woods. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he being chased by something? Had he fallen and gotten disoriented? The thought of him wandering deeper into the forest, scared and alone, tightened a knot in my chest. But then, something else caught my attention. Just beyond the next cluster of trees, I noticed an odd discoloration on the bark. Moving closer, I saw strange markings carved into the trunks, symbols I didn't recognize. They were crude but deliberate, etched deep into the wood. I reached out, running my fingers over one of the symbols. The grooves felt old, as if they'd been there for years, weathered by time and the elements. Yet there was something unsettling about them, something that made my skin crawl. "What the hell is this?" I muttered. I took a step back, shining my flashlight on the other trees. More symbols. They formed a rough circle around the area where I'd found the footprints. The air felt even colder here, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. A sudden noise made me whip around, heart hammering in my chest. It was faint, distant, the sound of something moving through the underbrush. I strained to listen, but the noise had already faded into the fog. "Tommy," I called out, my voice echoing unerringly in the stillness. No response. I stood there for a long moment, every muscle in my body tense. The trail of footprints continued beyond the circle of marked trees, leading deeper into the woods. I hesitated, glancing back the way I had come. I could still turn around, head back to the station, and regroup with the other rangers. But that would take time Tommy might not have. Gritting my teeth, I made my decision. I wasn't about to leave a scared kid out here alone, no matter how unsettling things got. "Hang in there, kid," I muttered again, more to myself than anyone else. I took a deep breath and stepped beyond the circle of trees, following the faint trail into the fog-drenched unknown. The forest seemed to close in tighter around me with every step, the fog growing thicker and the air colder. My flashlight flickered slightly, and I gave it a sharp tap, cursing under my breath. The last thing I needed was to lose my only reliable source of light. As I pressed on, the strange feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. It was as if the forest itself had eyes, hidden just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. I tried to shake the thought, focusing instead on the trail ahead. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the trail ended. I stopped, shining my flashlight in all directions. The footprints simply disappeared, as if Tommy had vanished into thin air. I turned in a slow circle, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. There was no sign of the boy, no sign of anything. But there was something else. A whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, carried on the cold breeze. It wasn't the wind. Couldn't be. It was too deliberate, too human. "Help." The word was faint, distant, but unmistakable. "Tommy," I shouted, moving toward the direction of the sound. My voice echoed briefly before fading into the fog. I waited, heart thudding in my chest, but there was no response. only the whispering breeze and the oppressive silence of the forest. Gripping my flashlight tighter, I took another step forward, my breath visible in the cold air. The knot of unease in my stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. The footprints, the symbols, the whispering. It all felt wrong, but I couldn't stop now. I had to find Tommy, even if something in the back of my mind whispered that I might not be the only one searching. Every step felt heavier, as though the forest itself resisted my presence. The fog hung low, clinging to the ground like a thick, ghostly blanket, and the cold air bit at my skin through the layers of my jacket. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something beyond the usual disorientation that came with being alone in the woods at night. There was a weight in the air, a tension that gnawed at the back of my mind. "Tommy," I called out again, my voice sounding small and fragile against the vast emptiness of the forest. The echoes bounced off the trees, distorting my voice and making it sound as though someone else had whispered my words back to me. "Silas." I swept my flashlight in a slow arc, the beam barely cutting through the swirling mist. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, twisting into shapes that looked almost human before vanishing into the gloom. My grip on the flashlight tightened. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the fog and darkness were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. I kept moving, my boots crunching softly against the damp leaves. The trail had all but disappeared beneath the underbrush, forcing me to rely on my instincts and memory of the terrain. I'd been on this trail countless times during the day, but at night, with visibility near zero, it felt unfamiliar, hostile. Even as I pushed deeper into the woods, the whispers started again. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but gradually growing louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, pleading. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest, and listened carefully. "Help me." The voice was distant, muffled by the fog, but it sounded like a child's. My breath caught in my throat. "Tommy, is that you?" I called, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you." No response. I moved quickly now, driven by a mix of hope and fear. The voice had come from somewhere ahead, deeper into the forest. But as I pushed forward, a nagging doubt crept into my mind. Something about the voice didn't feel right. It was too clear, too steady, almost rehearsed. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought. "Focus, Ethan. A child is missing. You don't have time to second-guess yourself." The whispers returned, this time closer. My heart raced as I scanned the darkness, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. "Tommy, keep talking. I'm getting closer." But the voice didn't respond. Instead, it shifted, echoing from a different direction, as though circling around me. I turned on my heel, shining the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing, just more trees and fog. "This doesn't make any sense," I muttered under my breath. I tried the radio again, hoping for a miracle. "Carrington to base 1. Do you copy?" Vivu. Static. Frustration bubbled up inside me, but I forced it down. Panicking wouldn't help anyone. I needed to stay calm, stay rational. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and focused on the sound of my own breathing. One step at a time, I told myself. One step at a time. As I continued forward, the fog seemed to thicken even more, if that was possible. The world around me felt smaller, more confined, as though the forest itself was closing in. I could barely see a few feet in front of me now, and every sound, the crunch of leaves, the rustle of branches, felt amplified, unnaturally loud. Then I saw it, a faint glow, just ahead, flickering like a distant candle flame. I froze, narrowing my eyes. It was too dim to be a flashlight, and too steady to be a reflection. My pulse quickened. Could it be Tommy? Had he found some sort of shelter, maybe built a small fire to keep warm? I approached cautiously, my flashlight aimed at the ground to avoid blinding whoever might be there. As I got closer, the glow became clearer, revealing itself as nothing. There was no fire, no light source, nothing that could explain the glow. Just an empty patch of forest, shrouded in fog. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, or not seeing. The glow had disappeared as soon as I got close, as though it had never been there to begin with. A chill ran down my spine, and I realized that the forest had gone completely silent. No whispers, no rustling leaves, nothing but the sound of my own breathing. I turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight around me. The shadows seemed deeper now, darker, as though the fog itself was thickening into something tangible. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to leave the woods and regroup. But I couldn't, not yet. Tommy, if you can hear me, call out. I tried again, my voice echoing through the trees. Please just keep talking. Still nothing. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to keep moving. Every step felt harder, as though the ground was pulling at my boots, trying to drag me down. The whispers returned, faint and distant, but this time I didn't call out. I just listened, trying to pinpoint the direction. Help me. The voice echoed through the darkness, coming from somewhere to my left. Sounded clearer now, more urgent. I turned toward it, shining the flashlight in that direction. The beam illuminated a narrow path winding through the trees, barely wide enough to walk through without brushing against the branches. I hesitated. The path wasn't part of any official trail I knew, and something about it felt wrong. But if there was even a chance that Tommy was down there, I had to take it. Hang in there, kid, I muttered, stepping onto the narrow path. The branches scraped against my jacket as I moved forward, the fog swirling around my feet. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, guiding me deeper into the unknown. And as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was waiting for me at the end of the path. The fog had thickened so much that I could barely see the trail in front of me. It felt like the trees themselves were closing in, their branches twisted and skeletal, reaching down like fingers trying to grab hold. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the occasional snap of a twig. But beyond those familiar noises, there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. A low hum filled the air, like distant static. I reached for my radio again, hoping that this time the interference had cleared. Carrington to base 1, do you copy? Ezra? I said, keeping my voice calm despite the tension gnawing at my insides. Nothing but more static. I frowned, turning the radio dial slightly and trying again. Carrington to any available ranger. Do you copy? Inver. Still nothing. I clipped the radio back to my belt with a sigh, glancing around the dense forest. I'd been in tough situations before. Storms that turned violent without warning, hikers injured miles from any help. But this was different. The silence, the fog, the strange whispers I thought I'd heard earlier. It all made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I forced myself to focus. Tommy was still out here, somewhere in this maze of trees. He had to be. Kids didn't just vanish into thin air. I needed to keep moving. As I pressed forward, the trail became harder to follow. Roots jutted out of the ground like old bones, and I had to watch every step to avoid tripping. The fog swirled around me, thick and cloying, muffling the world beyond. I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following me. I shook off the thought and kept walking. The trail was barely visible now, reduced to a faint path beneath layers of fallen leaves. I shone my flashlight ahead, hoping to catch sight of something. A flash of red, a sign that Tommy had passed through here. But all I saw were endless trees and fog. Then, just as I was about to call out again, I heard it, a faint sound, carried on the wind. It was distant, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakably human. Help! My heart leapt in my chest. It had to be Tommy. Tommy, I'm coming. Keep calling out, I shouted, breaking into a jog. My flashlight bobbed wildly as I moved, casting erratic beams of light across the forest. The voice didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it. But then it came again, faint but clearer this time. Help! Trees! I veered off the main trail, heading toward the sound. The ground was uneven here, covered in thick underbrush and moss. My boots sank slightly with each step, but I didn't slow down. The voice sounded close now, so close that I felt sure I'd find him any second. Tommy, keep talking. I need to find you, I called, my voice echoing strangely in the thick air. But the voice didn't answer this time. I stopped, breathing hard, and scanned the area with my flashlight. The beam flicked over trees and bushes, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. I turned in a slow circle, trying to get my bearings. That's when I noticed something odd. The fog, which had been swirling randomly around me, now seemed to be moving in a single direction, away from where I stood. It was as if an unseen force was pulling it deeper into the forest. I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong. The logical part of my mind was screaming at me to turn back, to stick to the main trail and wait for backup. But logic had no place in a search and rescue mission. If there was even a chance that Tommy was out there, I had to keep going. Steeling myself, I followed the strange current of fog. The air grew colder with every step, and the forest around me seemed to darken. My flashlight, which had been steady up until now, started to flicker. Not now, I muttered, smacking the side of the flashlight. The beam steadied for a moment before flickering again. Ahead, I saw movement, a faint blur in the fog. My heart pounded as I quickened my pace, half running toward it. The blur became clearer, resolving into the shape of a small figure. Tommy, I shouted, relief flooding through me. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, partially obscured by the fog. I slowed as I approached, suddenly cautious. Something about the way it stood, perfectly still, perfectly silent, didn't feel right. I raised my flashlight, shining the beam directly at it. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a flash of red, Tommy's jacket. But then the light flickered again, and the figure vanished. I stopped dead, my breath catching in my throat. I swept the flashlight around frantically, but there was nothing there, just trees and fog. Tommy, I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain. No answer. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Was it really Tommy? Or had the fog and darkness finally started to mess with my head? The radio at my belt crackled suddenly, making me jump. I grabbed it, hoping for a clear signal. Carrington, do you copy? Ava, a voice said, faint but recognizable as one of the other rangers. This is Carrington. I'm deep into the woods, near the old timber trail. I thought I saw something, but I trailed off, unsure how to explain what had just happened. We're trying to get a fix on your location, the voice said. Hang tight. Backup is on the way. Ava. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Understood. I'll keep searching. Over and out. Clipping the radio back to my belt, I turned in the direction where I thought I'd seen the figure. I wasn't sure what I was walking into, but one thing was certain. This night was far from over. I kept walking, though the trail felt like it was leading me into something far older than the park I knew. The trees around me grew denser, their skeletal branches forming a canopy so thick that barely any light from the moon could penetrate. The air felt different here, heavier, colder. Every breath I took seemed to hang in front of me longer than it should, twisting into strange shapes before dissolving into the fog. The trail beneath my feet was growing fainter, almost as if it hadn't been used in years. Leaves and pine needles covered much of the ground, and the occasional root jutted out like a warning. I swept my flashlight slowly from side to side, the beam catching glimpses of twisted trunks and gnarled branches. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest that Tommy had come this way. Yet something kept pulling me forward. "Tommy," I called out again, my voice sounding weaker, more uncertain. The fog swallowed the sound almost instantly, turning it into a dull echo that seemed to mock me. I paused for a moment, listening. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves as a faint breeze whispered through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was something deeper, something instinctual. Then I saw it, a faint shape up ahead, barely visible through the swirling fog. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was the first sign of anything unusual since I'd started down this trail. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and moved cautiously toward it. As I got closer, the shape became clearer. A tree, but not like any tree I'd ever seen before. Its bark was blackened and split, as though it had been struck by lightning. Yet there was no sign of fire damage. Strange markings were carved into the trunk, symbols I didn't recognize, but that sent a chill down my spine. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before brushing my fingers against the rough surface. The bark was ice cold, far colder than it should have been. I pulled my hand back quickly, wiping my fingers on my jacket as though I touched something unclean. A soft sound drifted through the fog, a whisper. It was faint, barely more than a breath of wind, but it sent a shiver through me. "Help!" My heart leapt into my throat. It was the same voice I'd heard earlier, distant but unmistakable. It was Tommy's voice. I turned in the direction of the sound and hurried forward, my flashlight casting jittery beams of light across the trees. The fog seemed to thicken as I moved, clinging to me like a living thing. I kept calling out, my voice growing hoarse, but the only response was the echo of my own words. Then the trail vanished. One moment I was walking along a narrow, well-defined path, and the next it was gone. I stopped abruptly, shining my flashlight in every direction. All I could see was an endless expanse of fog and trees. The trail that had been beneath my feet moments ago had simply disappeared, as though it had never existed. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind. I'd been following that trail for at least half an hour, and now it was just gone. I turned in a slow circle, trying to orient myself, but everything looked the same. The trees were too similar, the fog too thick. There was no landmark, no point of reference. "Tommy!" I shouted, louder this time, my voice echoing unnaturally in the still air. Nothing. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I'd been trained for situations like this, though none of my training had prepared me for whatever this was. I needed to think clearly. I pulled out my radio and tried to contact Base 1 again. "Carrington to Base 1. Do you copy?" "Asa." "Static. Carrington to any available ranger. I'm off trail and may be disoriented. Does anyone copy? Ever." More static. I lowered the radio, frustration and unease gnawing at me. The fog was likely interfering with the signal, but it didn't make me feel any better. I glanced around again, trying to find anything that might guide me back to the trail. That's when I noticed something strange. The ground beneath my feet wasn't covered in leaves and pine needles anymore. It was bare, almost as if something had swept the forest floor clean. The soil was dark and slightly damp, and it gave off a faint, metallic smell that made my stomach turn. I knelt down, running my fingers over the ground. It felt unnaturally smooth, like polished stone, but when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't stone at all. It was wood that had been worn down so perfectly that it resembled black glass. A chill ran through me. This wasn't natural. Nothing about this place was. I stood up quickly, wiping my hands on my pants. I had to get out of here. I turned back the way I thought I'd come, but after a few steps, I realized I had no idea which direction that was anymore. The fog had swallowed everything. "Tommy," I tried again, my voice barely a whisper now. And then, faintly, I heard it. This way. The voice was soft, almost melodic, and it didn't sound like Tommy anymore. It sounded older, deeper, but it carried the same eerie echo I'd heard earlier. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I took a step toward the sound. Then another. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker with each passing second. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I moved forward, the air growing colder with each step. Ahead, the fog parted slightly, revealing another blackened tree with the same strange markings carved into its bark. Beyond it, I could just make out the outline of something else, something that didn't belong in a forest. The structure. I hesitated, every nerve in my body on edge. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone out here. Not anymore. I don't know how long I'd been walking, but every step felt heavier than the last. The fog clung to me like a second skin, dampening my clothes and muffling every sound around me. My flashlight flickered occasionally, the beam weakening as the cold crept in. The tension in my chest tightened with each passing minute. The longer Tommy stayed out here, the more dangerous it became. And yet, something told me this wasn't going to be a straightforward rescue. Then I heard it. A faint, high-pitched sound carried on the cold air. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining my ears. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but no, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It sounded like a child's voice. Help! My heart pounded. That was no trick of the wind. It was a voice, small and desperate, echoing through the trees. I called out, my voice steady but urgent. Tommy, it's Ranger Carrington. I'm here to help. Keep calling out so I can find you. Silence followed, thick and impenetrable. I waited, listening, hoping to hear the voice again. A chill ran down my spine, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. An instinctive fear I couldn't shake. Something didn't feel right. I took a cautious step forward, shining my flashlight into the trees. The shadows danced and twisted, distorted by the fog. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a small figure darting between the trunks. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my pulse quickening. Tommy, I called again, my voice echoing eerily in the stillness. No answer, just the oppressive quiet of the forest, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I pressed on, following the direction where I thought I'd heard the voice. The ground grew uneven beneath my boots, roots snaking across the path like tripwires. My flashlight flickered again, casting erratic beams of light through the fog. I cursed under my breath, giving it a firm tap. The light steadied, but the flicker had done nothing to ease the growing unease gnawing at me. As I moved deeper into the woods, the whispers began again. This time, they were softer, almost like a chorus of distant voices, too faint to make out any words. They seemed to come from all around me, echoing through the fog like a distant song carried on the wind. Help! Please! The voice was closer now, more distinct. It was unmistakably a child's voice, but something about it felt off. It wasn't just the tone, it was the way it carried, almost as if it were coming from more than one direction at once. I stopped again, sweeping my flashlight around in a wide arc. The fog made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead, and the trees seemed to close in tighter, their gnarled branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy above. Tommy, if you can hear me, keep talking. I'm coming to get you, I called, trying to keep the edge of fear out of my voice. This wasn't the time to panic. I had to stay focused, stay rational. Another sound reached my ears, a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I turned quickly, aiming my flashlight toward the source. For a split second, I thought I saw a small figure crouched among the roots of a large tree. Though when I blinked, it was gone. Hello, I said, taking a cautious step forward. The forest responded with silence. I hesitated, glancing back the way I had come. The trail was barely visible now, swallowed by the swirling fog. A part of me wanted to turn back, regroup with the other rangers, and come at this search with more manpower. But I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that if I didn't find Tommy soon, I might not find him at all. Taking another deep breath, I pressed forward. The air grew colder with each step, and the fog seemed to thicken, wrapping around me like a living thing. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could feel the dampness seeping through my jacket. Then I saw it, a flash of red, just ahead, partially obscured by a cluster of bushes. My heart leapt into my throat, and I quickened my pace, closing the distance as fast as I could without tripping over the uneven ground. "Tommy," I called, hope rising in my chest. But as I reached the spot, I stopped short. It wasn't Tommy. It was a small piece of red fabric, caught on a thorny branch. I reached out and touched it, feeling the damp texture beneath my fingers. It looked like it had been torn from a jacket, a child's jacket. "Damn it," I muttered, glancing around. The fabric was fresh, which meant Tommy had been here recently. But where was he now? I scanned the ground for more signs. Footprints, broken branches, anything that might give me a clue. But the fog made it difficult to see, and the whispering had started again, growing louder and more insistent. It sounded like multiple voices now, overlapping and echoing in a way that made my head throb. "Help!" The voice was closer than ever, but it didn't sound right. There was something unnatural about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and took another step forward, my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. I felt a sudden wave of dizziness, like the ground beneath me was shifting. "Tommy, if you can hear me, stay where you are. I'm coming," I shouted, forcing myself to keep moving despite the growing fear in my chest. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. This wasn't just a lost child anymore. There was something else out here, something I couldn't see, but could feel all around me. And whatever it was, it didn't want me to leave. I could feel the cold settling deep into my bones as I trudged forward, my flashlight flickering slightly as if it, too, was growing weary of this endless search. The fog wrapped around the trees in thick tendrils, masking everything beyond a few feet. Each step felt heavier, as if the forest itself was reluctant to let me pass. "Tommy," I called again, my voice echoing hollowly through the stillness. Nothing, no response, just the muted rustle of leaves in the faint breeze. It was unnerving how quiet everything had become, like the woods were holding their breath. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but the beam only revealed more mist and shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me from just beyond the edge of visibility. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I faced rough conditions before. Storms, deep forest searches, even encounters with wildlife. But this was different. There was something intangible about the atmosphere tonight, something that made every instinct in my body scream at me to turn back. Yet I couldn't, not when there was still a chance of finding Tommy. As I moved deeper into the woods, I noticed how the trees seemed to twist unnaturally, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The fog clung to them, giving the whole scene a surreal, almost dreamlike quality. My flashlight caught glimpses of shapes in the mist, vague, fleeting forms that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them. Shadows playing tricks, I told myself. Just shadows. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flash of red. My heart leapt, and I instinctively turned, shining my flashlight in the direction of the color. For a moment, I thought I saw a small figure standing among the trees, partially obscured by the fog. The red jacket. It had to be Tommy. "Tommy," I called, my voice sharper now, fueled by hope and urgency. I took a step toward the figure, but just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the mist. I stood there, frozen for a moment, the echoes of my voice fading into the stillness. My mind raced, torn between disbelief and determination. Couldn't have imagined that. I saw the red jacket. I was sure of it. Tommy, if you can hear me, stay where you are. I'm coming to get you. I forced my legs to move, pushing through the underbrush toward where I'd seen the figure. Branches snagged at my jacket, and the ground grew uneven, but I didn't slow down. The thought of the boy being so close, yet just out of reach, drove me forward. But as I reached the spot, there was nothing. No sign of Tommy. No footprints, no disturbed leaves. Just the same dense fog and twisted trees. I spun in a slow circle, shining my flashlight in every direction. Tommy, I called again, my voice sounding more uncertain now. Silence. I clenched my jaw, frustration and worry gnawing at me. Had he run off again? Was he hiding? Had I just imagined the whole thing? Couldn't let doubt creep in. I knew what I saw. Stay calm, I muttered to myself. Stay focused. I knelt down, examining the ground more closely. The fog made it difficult to see much, but after a few moments, I spotted something. A faint indentation in the soft earth, like a small footprint. It was hard to tell for sure, but it looked fresh. Okay, kid, I whispered under my breath. You're close. I just have to find you. I followed the faint trail, moving slowly and carefully. The fog seemed to grow thicker with each step, and the trees pressed in closer, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out what little moonlight filtered through. It felt as if I were walking through a tunnel, the forest closing in around me. Then I heard it, a faint sound, barely more than a whisper. It was distant but unmistakable, a child's voice. Help? I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. Tommy, I called, straining to hear more. Where are you? The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it seemed to drift through the trees, carried by the wind. It was impossible to pinpoint its exact location, but it sounded close. I moved forward, following the sound as best I could. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees rearranging themselves in the fog. My sense of direction wavered, but I kept going, driven by the desperate hope that I was getting closer. Hang on, Tommy, I said aloud, more for myself than anything. I'm coming. The voice came again, clearer this time. Help, trees? I picked up my pace, heart pounding in my chest. The flashlight beam flickered, casting erratic shadows across the forest floor. I didn't care. All that mattered was finding that voice, finding Tommy. Then, through the fog, I saw another glimpse of red. This time it was unmistakable. The small figure stood just ahead, partially obscured by a cluster of trees. He wasn't moving. Tommy, I shouted, relief flooding through me. It's okay. I'm here. Stay right there. I rushed toward him, my flashlight trembling in my grip. But as I drew closer, something felt wrong. The figure didn't move, didn't react to my voice. He just stood there, perfectly still. I slowed down, my heart pounding harder now for a different reason. Tommy, I said again, more cautiously this time. The figure remained motionless, shrouded in fog. I took another step forward, and that's when I realized it wasn't a boy. It wasn't anything human. The red I had seen was a tattered piece of fabric caught on a low branch, swaying gently in the breeze. And beneath it, half buried in the leaves, was something else. Something that made my blood run cold. It was a small, mud-covered shoe. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The shoe was too small to belong to anyone but a child. Tommy? I whispered, a knot tightening in my chest. I reached down and picked up the shoe, brushing off the dirt. It was old, worn, like it had been out here for a long time. And that's when I felt it, that overwhelming sense of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a chill ran down my spine. I stood slowly, clutching the shoe tightly in my hand. The forest was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. A heavy, expectant silence that made every instinct scream at me to leave. But I couldn't, not without finding Tommy. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Whatever was happening out here, I wasn't gonna back down. Couldn't. Not while there was still a chance of finding that boy. "I'll find you," I whispered into the fog, more determined than ever, no matter what it takes. And with that, I pressed on, deeper into the woods. The shoe clutched tightly in my hand as the fog swallowed me whole. I'm not sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way, the forest changed. It wasn't just the thickening fog or the eerie silence. Those things had been with me since I started the search. No, this was something deeper, something I could feel in my bones. The air seemed heavier, charged with a strange electric tension. Every instinct I had screamed that I was being watched. I forced myself to keep moving, gripping my flashlight tightly. Its beam flickered slightly, casting long, distorted shadows across the trees. The woods had taken on a surreal quality, as if they were shifting around me with every step I took. I tried to shake off the unease clawing at the edges of my mind. This wasn't the time to lose focus. "Tommy," I called out, my voice sounding strained and hollow in the dense air. It felt like the fog swallowed my words before they could go far. No answer, just the faint rustling of leaves and the sound of my own breathing. I pressed forward, each step more cautious than the last. The trail had become almost unrecognizable, the familiar landmarks obscured by the ever-present mist. I knew this park like the back of my hand, but right now it felt like I was walking through someone else's world. A world that didn't want me here. The radio at my belt crackled faintly, startling me. I stopped and pulled it free, hoping for a signal. "Carrington to base 1. Do you copy? Ava." Static. Then, just for a moment, I thought I heard something beneath it. A faint whisper, too garbled to make out. I waited, listening intently, but the static returned to its usual monotony. With a sigh, I clipped the radio back onto my belt and kept moving. The fog thickened around me, making it harder to see more than a few feet ahead. I had to rely on the narrow beam of my flashlight, which flickered again, making my pulse quicken. That's when I felt it. Presence. It's hard to explain, but there was no mistaking it. It was as if something unseen had slipped into the space around me, watching from the shadows just beyond the reach of my light. I stopped in my tracks, every muscle tensing as I scanned the area. "Tommy," I tried again, my voice barely above a whisper. Still nothing. I listened carefully, straining to catch any sound other than my own breathing. The forest was unnervingly silent, too silent. Not even the wind stirred the leaves now. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, loud and insistent. Then I caught it movement, just a flicker of something at the edge of my vision. I swung the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. Just trees and fog, stretching endlessly into the darkness. I took a step forward, and that's when I heard it again. Whispers. This time they were clearer, though I still couldn't make out the words. They seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the trees in a disorienting way. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight in every direction, but I saw nothing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, felt like they were pressing in on me, trying to worm their way into my mind. My grip tightened on the flashlight, and I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "It's just the fog," I muttered under my breath. "It's messing with the sound." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. There was something unnatural about those whispers, something that didn't belong in this world. They weren't just sounds carried by the wind. They had a purpose, a malicious intent. I moved faster now, ignoring the way my heart pounded in my chest. I needed to find Tommy and get out of these woods. Whatever was out here, I didn't want to meet it. Another sound reached my ears. Footsteps, light, hesitant, as if someone was trying to sneak through the forest. My breath caught in my throat, and I swung the flashlight toward the source. "Tommy," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is that you?" The footsteps stopped. I waited, my heart pounding painfully in my chest. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then, from somewhere ahead, I heard it again. "Help!" The voice was faint, almost too faint to hear, but it was there. It sounded like a child's voice, scared, vulnerable. "Tommy!" I shouted, breaking into a run. My flashlight bounced wildly as I moved, the beam barely keeping up with my frantic pace. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more urgent. They seemed to surround me, coming from every direction at once. I tried to block them out, focusing only on the voice of the child. "Help!" I reached a small clearing and stopped, panting for breath. The fog was thinner here, allowing me to see a little farther. I swung the flashlight around, searching desperately for any sign of the boy. "Tommy, where are you?" I called out. No answer, but I felt it again, the presence. It was closer now, almost tangible. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold chill ran down my spine. I turned slowly, shining the flashlight behind me. Nothing, and then, just at the edge of the clearing, I saw it. The figure. It was barely more than a shadow, blending almost perfectly with the fog. Stood still, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew without a doubt that it was watching. I took a step back, my pulse racing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and unmoving, as if waiting for something. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. No response. I took another step back, keeping the flashlight trained on the figure. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a person, an animal, or something else entirely? Before I could decide, the figure melted into the fog, disappearing as if it had never been there. The whispers faded with it, leaving behind only the sound of my ragged breathing. I stood there for a long moment, trying to steady myself. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't Tommy, but it was out here somewhere watching, and I had a feeling it wasn't done with me yet. The darkness was absolute now, swallowing the last remnants of twilight. My flashlight cast a narrow beam of pale light, barely strong enough to pierce the thick fog that clung to everything around me. Each breath I took came out in visible puffs, vanishing almost as quickly as they formed. The cold gnawed at my exposed skin, but I barely noticed it anymore. There was something far more unsettling gnawing at my mind. The forest had grown unerringly silent, not just the quiet of nightfall in the woods. This was something deeper and more oppressive. Even the wind, which had whispered through the trees earlier, seemed to have abandoned this place. All I could hear was the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. "Tommy," my voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. It echoed oddly, as if the fog itself absorbed the sound and sent it back distorted. No response. I pressed on, forcing myself to keep moving. The trail had become harder to follow, the ground uneven and littered with twisted roots that seemed to claw at my feet. I knew I couldn't be far from where I last thought I heard the boy's voice, but the further I went, the more disoriented I felt. It was as though the forest itself had shifted, rearranging its features just to confuse me. The flashlight flickered. I froze, tightening my grip on the handle. A quick shake brought the light back to full strength, but the brief flicker had been enough to send my heart racing. I couldn't afford to lose the light out here. Not now. I tried the radio again, more out of habit than hope. "Carrington to base 1. Do you copy? Inver." Static. I released the button, listening intently. For a moment, I thought I heard something beneath the static. A faint whisper, too low to make out. I brought the radio closer to my ear, straining to hear, but it was gone. "Come on, come on," I muttered, frustration creeping into my voice. I tried hailing the other rangers once more, but the only response was the same steady hiss of static. Something wasn't right. I knew these woods, knew how sound carried through the trees, how shadows played tricks on tired eyes. But this wasn't just shadows or tricks of the light. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. It was as if the forest itself was watching, waiting. I forced myself to keep moving. Each step felt harder, as though the forest floor was growing softer, trying to pull me down. The fog swirled around my ankles, thick and cloying. My flashlight flickered again, this time longer, before returning to its steady beam. My pulse quickened. Then I heard it. Help! Trees! The voice was faint, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably human. My heart leapt, and without thinking, I turned toward the sound. It came from somewhere off the trail, deeper into the dense woods. "Tommy," I called, my voice trembling slightly despite my effort to stay calm. "Tommy, it's Ranger Carrington. I'm here to help. Where are you?" Silence. I took a tentative step forward, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam illuminated nothing but thick trunks and tangled underbrush. I hesitated. Every instinct told me not to leave the trail. It was too easy to get lost in these woods, especially at night. But if that voice really was Tommy, help came again, clearer this time but still distant. I clenched my jaw, weighing my options. If I ignored it and kept to the trail, I risked leaving the boy out here alone. If I followed the voice, I risked getting lost myself. I made my decision. "Hang on, Tommy. I'm coming," I said aloud, more to reassure myself than anything else. I stepped off the trail, pushing through the underbrush. Branches snagged at my jacket, and the ground grew softer beneath my boots. But I pressed on. The fog seemed thicker here, swirling in dense tendrils that wrapped around me like a living thing. "Help!" The voice was closer now, but it still sounded off. There was something about the tone, something I couldn't quite place. It was almost as if it wasn't coming from one direction, but from all around me. I stopped, shining my flashlight in a slow arc. Shadows danced at the edges of the beam, shifting and stretching unnaturally. My grip on the flashlight tightened. "Tommy, if you can hear me, call out again," I said, my voice steady despite the knot forming in my stomach. No answer. The silence pressed in around me, thick and suffocating. My breath came faster, each exhale visible in the cold air. I tried to focus, to keep my thoughts clear. Panic wouldn't help me or Tommy. I took another step forward, then another. The ground was soft, almost spongy, and the air felt colder here. The flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't come back right away. I shook it frantically, my pulse racing. "Come on, don't do this now," I muttered through clenched teeth. Finally, the light returned, casting its pale glow once more. But in that brief moment of darkness, I thought I saw something. A sheep, standing just beyond the reach of the beam, tall, thin, and motionless. I whipped the flashlight toward where I thought I saw it, but there was nothing there, just trees and fog. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to steady my breathing. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The fog, the darkness, the stress. It was all combining to mess with my senses. "Keep it together, Ethan," I whispered to myself. "Find the boy. Get out." I took another step forward, but something stopped me. A sound, faint and distant, carried on the still air. Laughter. Soft, childlike laughter, echoing through the trees. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound didn't belong here. It was wrong, too out of place in the suffocating silence of the forest. "Tommy," I called out, but my voice was barely a whisper. The laughter faded, replaced once again by the oppressive stillness. I stood there, flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. And then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, the voice came again. "Help! Trees!" But this time it didn't sound like a plea. It sounded like an invitation. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, each exhale forming a brief cloud in the frigid night air. I've been following the voice for what felt like hours, though in reality, it had probably only been minutes. Every instinct told me to turn back, that this wasn't right, but I couldn't, not when the faint sound of Tommy's voice echoed through the woods ahead. Help? Trees. It was so faint, so weak, that I couldn't be sure it was real. Yet it pulled me forward, deeper into the heart of the forest. My flashlight flickered, its beams struggling against the dense fog that wrapped around me like a living thing. The trail had long since disappeared beneath layers of damp leaves and twisted roots, but I pressed on, guided by that fragile, desperate voice. "Hang on, Tommy. I'm coming," I muttered under my breath, more to steady myself than anything else. The trees closed in around me, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The whispering wind carried strange sounds, half-heard and fleeting, making it impossible to tell whether they were natural or something else entirely. I kept my hand on the radio clipped to my belt, though it had been silent for some time now. No static, no interference, just dead air. And then, through the swirling fog, I saw it. The figure, small, motionless, standing near the edge of a cliff that loomed out of the darkness ahead. My heart lurched in my chest. "Tommy," I called out, my voice breaking the unnatural silence. The figure didn't move. I quickened my pace, closing the distance between us as quickly as I could without slipping on the damp, uneven ground. The flashlight's beam trembled in my hand, casting jittery shadows across the forest floor. As I drew closer, the figure came into clearer focus. A boy, no older than 6, wearing a red jacket. Relief surged through me, momentarily overwhelming the gnawing fear in my gut. "Tommy, it's okay. I'm here. We're going to get you home," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. Still, he didn't respond. He stood perfectly still, facing the edge of the cliff, as if transfixed by something beyond the abyss. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and tugging at my jacket, but Tommy didn't react to it. He didn't seem to feel the cold. Something was wrong. I slowed my approach, every sense on high alert. "Tommy," I tried again, softer this time, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile reality around us. When I was only a few feet away, he finally turned. Slowly, too slowly. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, they didn't look right. They were glassy, unfocused, as if he were looking through me rather than at me. A shiver ran down my spine, colder than the night air. "Tommy, are you okay?" I asked, kneeling down to his level. I reached out, my hand hovering inches from his shoulder, hesitant to make contact. He didn't answer. Instead, he opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Only a faint, raspy whisper, barely audible over the wind. "Leave." I blinked, pulling my hand back instinctively. "What did you say?" "Leave," he whispered again, his voice sounding strange. Not like a child's, but layered, as if something else was speaking through him. A deep, primal fear gripped me, rooting me to the spot. The flashlight flickered once more, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance around us. I forced myself to stand, every muscle in my body screaming at me to turn and run, but I couldn't leave him there. Couldn't. "Come on, Tommy. We need to get away from the edge," I said, my voice steady despite the terror coiling in my chest. I took a careful step forward, reaching out again. This time, my hand made contact with his shoulder. His skin was ice cold. Before I could react, the ground beneath us shifted. A low rumble echoed through the forest, and a section of the cliff crumbled away, sending rocks tumbling into the void below. I grabbed Tommy and pulled him back just in time, stumbling as I did. He fell against me, limp and unresponsive, but I managed to keep us both from going over the edge. "We need to move," I said, more to myself than to him. I hoisted him into my arms, his small frame unnaturally light. He didn't struggle, didn't speak, just rested his head against my shoulder, as cold and still as a doll. The wind howled louder now, carrying with it those strange whispers I'd been hearing all night. They seemed to come from all around us, rising and falling in a chaotic rhythm. I didn't wait to find out what they meant. Clutching Tommy tightly, I turned and began retracing my steps, heading away from the cliff and back toward the faint hope of safety. Each step felt heavier than the last, the forest pressing in around me, the fog thickening until I could barely see my own feet. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of unseen voices urging me to leave, or perhaps warning me of something worse. I didn't stop, couldn't stop. When the radio at my belt crackled to life, the sound was so sudden and jarring that I nearly dropped the flashlight. I fumbled for the device, pressing the button with numb fingers. "Carrington, do you copy?" "Ozer," a voice said, clear and steady. Relief flooded through me. "This is Carrington. I found Tommy. We're heading back now. Eva." "Roger that." Base one out. I didn't have the energy to say more. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, the weight of the boy in my arms a constant reminder of how close we'd come to disaster. The forest seemed to resist my progress, every step feeling like a battle against some unseen force. But eventually, the fog began to thin, and the trees grew less oppressive. The whispers faded, replaced by the familiar sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I kept moving, driven by the desperate need to get Tommy to safety. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw the distant lights of the ranger station, I nearly collapsed from relief. The nightmare of the woods still clung to me, but I knew we were out. We were safe, at least for now. I stood at the edge of the cliff, staring into the abyss below. The fog hung thick and heavy, swirling like a living thing over the jagged rocks far beneath me. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud and insistent, as though trying to warn me of something I couldn't quite see. Tommy had been right there, standing at the edge of the cliff, his small figure barely visible in the mist. I had seen him, I knew I had, but in the blink of an eye he had vanished. One moment he was there and the next, nothing. Just empty air and the suffocating silence of the woods. I took a step back from the edge, my legs unsteady. My flashlight flickered, casting jittery shadows across the twisted branches and moss-covered rocks around me. I tried to steady my breathing, but every inhale felt like dragging in ice. "Tommy," I called again, my voice cracking slightly. It echoed back to me, hollow and distorted by the fog. No answer came. Only the whisper of the wind through the trees. Something wasn't right. I had known it for a while now, but this was beyond strange. It felt as though the forest itself had turned against me, like it was toying with me, leading me deeper into some trap I couldn't see. I gripped the radio at my belt, fingers trembling slightly. "Carrington to base 1. Do you copy?" "Eva." Static. I tried again. "Carrington to any available ranger. Do you copy?" "Eva." More static, followed by a faint crackle that almost sounded like breathing. I released the button and stared down at the radio, my pulse quickening. I had dealt with bad signals before, but this was different. The static wasn't just interference. It felt alive, like something was lurking just beyond the range of my hearing. And then, clear as day, I heard it. "Leave." The word was whispered, low and drawn out, but unmistakable. It wasn't my imagination. Someone or something had spoken. "Who's there?" I demanded, shining my flashlight in a wide arc around me. The beam illuminated nothing but the dense fog and gnarled trees. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast, oppressive silence. "Leave." The whisper came again, this time closer. It seemed to drift from the shadows themselves, carried on the cold, damp air. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run, but I forced myself to stay put. I couldn't leave, not without Tommy. No matter how wrong this felt, no matter how badly my nerves were fraying, I had a job to do. I'm not leaving until I find the boy, I said aloud, more for my own benefit than anything else. My voice wavered slightly, betraying the fear gnawing at the edges of my resolve. The whisper didn't respond. Instead, the forest seemed to grow even quieter, as if holding its breath. I took another step back from the cliff, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The fog shifted and swirled, creating fleeting shapes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. I turned away from the cliff and started retracing my steps, each step feeling heavier than the last. The path was barely visible now, the fog wrapping around the trees like a pale curtain. My flashlight flickered again, the beam dimming slightly before stabilizing. I cursed under my breath and gave it a shake. That was when I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, my hand tightening around the flashlight. The sound was coming from behind me, from the direction of the cliff. Slowly, I turned, shining the beam toward the edge. There was nothing there, but the rustling continued, growing louder, closer. It circled around me, the sound shifting from one side to the other, as though something unseen was moving just beyond the range of the light. Show yourself, I barked, the tension in my voice evident. The rustling stopped abruptly, leaving only the deafening silence of the woods. I stood there, every muscle in my body taut, waiting for something, anything to happen. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and still nothing emerged from the fog. Slowly, I lowered the flashlight, exhaling a shaky breath. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I felt it, a cold breath against the back of my neck. I spun around, heart pounding, but again saw nothing. The whisper came once more, this time directly in my ear. Leave. Panic surged through me, a primal instinct to flee overwhelming every rational thought. But even as fear gripped me, something deeper held me in place. I couldn't leave, not without knowing what had happened to Tommy. I couldn't abandon him, even if it meant facing whatever malevolent force was out here. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. If you can hear me, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm not leaving without the boy. The whisper didn't return. Instead, the forest remained deathly still, as though waiting for me to make the next move. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and started walking again, this time with more urgency. Every step felt like a gamble, each moment stretching into an eternity. I didn't know what was out here with me, but one thing was certain: it didn't want me here. And yet, I had no choice but to keep going. The whisper had warned me to leave, but I wasn't done yet. Every muscle in my body screamed for rest, but I didn't dare stop. Not now. The fog had begun to thin slightly, but the cold clung to me, sinking deep into my bones. My breath came in ragged puffs, visible in the dim glow of my flashlight. Each step I took felt heavier, as if the forest itself were trying to hold me back. I glanced over my shoulder again. Instinctively, I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. That whisper from earlier, that chilling, inhuman command to leave, echoed in my mind, setting my nerves on edge. Just keep moving, I whispered to myself, forcing my legs to carry me forward. I needed to find the main trail again. Once I was back on familiar ground, I could figure out what to do next. The trees around me seemed taller now, their twisted branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. The path beneath my boots was uneven, littered with roots and rocks. It didn't look like any trail I recognized, and that only made things worse. I knew Acadia National Park better than most people ever would, yet this place felt foreign and wrong. Carrington to Base 1, I said into the radio, trying once again to raise someone. Anyone? Do you copy? Ava. Static. I sighed, clipping the radio back to my belt. At this point, I wasn't even sure if it was malfunctioning or if something else was interfering with the signal. Either way, I was on my own. I tried to focus on my surroundings, scanning for any landmarks that might guide me. The fog had thinned enough for me to make out the shapes of trees a few yards ahead. But beyond that, everything dissolved into a gray void. Every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the rustle of branches swaying in the faint breeze, even my own breathing. Then I heard it again, the whispering. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of my footsteps, but it was there. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The whispers seemed to come from all around me, weaving through the trees like an invisible presence. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Cold, insistent, and somehow familiar. "I don't have time for this," I muttered, forcing myself to keep moving. Fear was trying to take root again, and I couldn't afford to let it. Not now. I pushed forward, quickening my pace. The ground beneath me became more uneven, and I stumbled a couple of times, barely managing to catch myself before falling. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I wondered if I was walking in circles. Then, finally, I saw something familiar. A cluster of boulders near the base of a hill. Relief washed over me. I knew those rocks. They marked the edge of the old timber trail. If I could just make it over the hill, I'd be back on the main pass. I scrambled up the incline, using my free hand to steady myself against the rocks. The climb was steeper than I remembered, and the cold made my fingers clumsy. By the time I reached the top, I was breathing hard, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I looked down the other side of the hill, my breath caught in my throat. The trail was there, just as I'd hoped, but standing in the middle of it, partially obscured by the lingering fog, was a figure. "Tommy," I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the stillness. The figure didn't move. I took a cautious step forward, shining my flashlight toward the figure. The beam caught on something red, a jacket. My heart skipped a beat. "Tommy, is that you?" I called again, louder this time. Still no response. I moved closer, my flashlight trained on the figure. As I got nearer, the fog seemed to shift, revealing more of the form standing in the trail. It was small, childlike, but something about it didn't feel right. "Hey kid, it's okay. I'm here to help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Just as I reached the edge of the trail, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. I stopped, staring at the empty trail, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. I knew what I'd seen, or at least I thought I did, but the rational part of my brain was already trying to explain it away. A trick of the fog, a shadow, my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence. The whispering had stopped, and the forest felt different, lighter somehow. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me was gone. Taking a deep breath, I started down the trail, moving quickly but carefully. I needed to get back to the ranger station. I needed answers, and more than anything, I needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was lurking in these woods. By the time I reached the familiar split in the trail that led back toward the main entrance, the fog had lifted almost entirely. The stars were visible overhead, and the chill in the air felt less menacing. "Carrington to base 1, I said into the radio, not expecting a response but trying anyway. "I'm back on the main trail, heading toward the station. Eva." This time, the radio crackled briefly before a voice came through, faint but clear. "Base 1 to Carrington. We've got the boy. He's safe. Found him near the entrance about 15 minutes ago. Eva." I stopped in my tracks, the words sinking in slowly. "Repeat that. You found him near the entrance?" "Eva." "Affirmative. Kid's fine. A little shaken up, but no injuries. Parents are with him now." "Eva." I didn't respond right away. My mind was reeling. How could he have been near the entrance when I'd been following his trail deep into the woods? And what about the figure I'd seen on the path? Understood, I finally said. Heading back now. Over and out. I clipped the radio to my belt and resumed walking. My thoughts a tangled mess. Relief mixed with confusion and something else. A lingering unease that refused to go away. As I neared the station, I glanced back one last time. The forest loomed behind me, silent and dark, its secrets hidden once again by the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd encountered out there, whatever had been whispering in the fog, was still watching, waiting. By the time I broke through the last stretch of dense forest and saw the dim glow of the manger station's lights flickering through the fog, I could barely feel my fingers. The cold had crept into my bones hours ago, and each breath I took came out in ragged, frosty puffs. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by something darker, a lingering dread that clung to me like the mist. I reached for my radio with stiff fingers and pressed the button. Carrington to Base 1. I'm nearing the station. Do you copy? Bizzle. There was a brief crackle of static before a voice came through, clearer than it had been in hours. Carrington, we copy. Good to hear your voice. You all right out there? Evil. I'm fine. No sign of the boy where I was searching, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Heading in now. Over and out. I didn't mention the whispers or the strange feeling of being followed. Felt too surreal, too fragile to say aloud. I couldn't shake the thought that saying it would make it real. As I approached the manger station, I saw a group of figures standing near the entrance. The fog made them blurry, like shadows moving through water. But as I drew closer, I recognized the boy's parents. Their faces were pale, etched with exhaustion and fear. But there was something else there now, a spark of hope. The volunteer ranger, a younger guy named Luke, stepped forward. Carrington, we found him, he said, his voice tight with both relief and confusion. The kid turned up near the entrance to the park about 20 minutes ago. He's fine, cold, scared, but unharmed. I stopped in my tracks, the weight of the past hours hitting me all at once. Near the entrance? I repeated, my voice low. That didn't make sense. I had been searching deep in the woods, far from where the boy was last seen. How had he ended up near the entrance? Yeah, Luke said, running a hand through his hair. It's weird. He doesn't remember much. Just says he got lost, then saw some lights and walked toward them. Lights? There hadn't been any lights out there except for my flashlight. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what had happened. The whispers, the shifting shadows, the strange sense that the forest had been leading me somewhere. None of it fit with the simple explanation of a boy wandering back to safety on his own. Where is he now? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Inside, warming up, Luke said, gesturing toward the cabin. The medics checked him over. He's a little shaken, but otherwise fine. I nodded and headed toward the door, my thoughts a tangled mess. As I stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin hit me like a wave, but it did little to chase away the chill that had settled in my chest. Tommy sat on a wooden bench near the fireplace, wrapped in a thick blanket. His eyes were wide, still glassy with fear, but he looked unharmed. Hey, Tommy, I said gently, crouching down so I was at eye level with him. You okay, buddy? He nodded slowly, clutching the edges of the blanket tightly around him. I got lost, he said in a small voice. I tried to find my way back. But what? I prompted, keeping my voice calm and steady. He glanced toward the window, where the fog still pressed against the glass like a living thing. There were voices, he whispered, in the trees. They told me to stay away from the dark places. A shiver ran down my spine. Voices, I repeated, keeping my expression neutral. Did you see anyone? He shook his head quickly. No, just heard them. They said I'd be safe if I stayed near the lights. I didn't know what to say. Every instinct I had as a ranger, as someone who had spent years in these woods, told me that what Tommy was describing shouldn't have been possible. But I had heard the whispers too, in the lights. Whatever they had been, they hadn't come for me. You did the right thing by following the lights, I said after a moment, giving him a reassuring smile. You're safe now. He nodded again, and I stood, turning toward the others. Luke gave me a questioning look, but I shook my head slightly. Now wasn't the time to explain what I didn't fully understand myself. As the boy's parents gathered him up, thanking everyone profusely, I stepped outside to clear my head. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the dark outlines of the trees against the night sky. Stars peeked through the thinning mist, cold and distant. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the crisp air and trying to make sense of what had happened. The rational part of my mind wanted to dismiss it all as stress and exhaustion. Maybe the boy had just gotten lucky. Maybe the voices and the lights were figments of his imagination. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in those woods, something that didn't belong in any map or report. And tonight, it had led both me and Tommy through a place where logic didn't hold sway. The radio at my belt crackled again, and I picked it up. Carrington here, just checking in. Luke's voice came through. You all right? I hesitated, staring out at the forest. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper than before, as if hiding something just out of sight. Yeah, I said finally. I'm all right, over and out. But even as I said it, I knew that something had changed. The forest hadn't let us go, not really. It was still out there watching, waiting, and I had a feeling that this wasn't over. The cabin door creaked as I pushed it open, the familiar scent of wood smoke and damp earth greeting me like an old companion. I stepped inside and dropped my gear by the door, my legs aching from hours of trudging through the dense forest. The warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth should have brought comfort, but tonight it did little to dispel the chill clinging to my skin. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened out there. The boy, Tommy, had been found near the entrance to the park, completely unharmed and with no memory of how he got there. His parents had rushed to his side, tears streaming down their faces, thanking me profusely even though I hadn't been the one to find him. Another ranger had stumbled upon him while I was still deep in the woods, chasing shadows and whispers. I leaned against the wooden table, running a hand through my hair, still damp from the fog. None of it made sense. The trail I had followed, the whispers, the strange flickers of red that I had seen. All of it felt like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. I pulled out my notebook and began jotting down everything I could remember, hoping that seeing it all on paper might help me make sense of it. 1. Fog thicker than usual, limiting visibility to a few feet. 2. Heard whispers several times. No clear source. 3. Spotted flashes of red. Thought it was Tommy's jacket, but nothing there. Tia. The voice calling for help sounded human but. I stopped writing, staring at the last note. That voice had stuck with me more than anything else. It had sounded like a child, but there was something unnatural about it, as though it had been trying too hard to sound human. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I stood, crossing the small room in a few strides, and opened the door to find Ranger Bailey, one of the more experienced rangers on the team. She looked concerned, her brow furrowed beneath her knit cap. Hey Ethan, just wanted to check in on you. Heard you had a rough night out there. Yeah, I said, stepping aside to let her in. Come on in. I was just trying to make sense of it all. She walked over to the fire, rubbing her hands together for warmth. Everyone's glad the kid's okay, but it's weird, isn't it? How he ended up back at the entrance without anyone seeing him. And you didn't find anything? Nothing but footprints that led to nowhere and, well, some strange things I can't explain. I hesitated, wondering how much to share. Did Tommy say anything about what happened? Daly shook her head. No, he just kept saying he didn't remember. Said he was walking, then everything went foggy, and next thing he knew, he was near the parking lot. She paused, her expression thoughtful. Ethan, you don't think that there's something out there? I finished for her, my voice low. I don't know, but it felt like the forest didn't want me to find him. Daly didn't laugh or dismiss my words, which I appreciated. She knew as well as I did that the park held its fair share of strange stories. Rangers talked about them in hushed tones, swapping tales of odd lights, strange sounds, and the occasional hiker who swore they had been followed by something unseen. You think it's connected to the old stories? She asked after a moment. I shrugged. I don't know what to think. All I know is that I heard things out there tonight that I've never heard before. Saw things I can't explain. Daly nodded slowly. You should get some rest. It's been a long night. Yeah, you're right. Thanks for checking in. She gave me a small smile before heading back out into the night, the door creaking shut behind her. I stood there for a moment, listening to the wind howling softly outside. Then I turned back to my notebook, flipping to a blank page. There was one more thing I hadn't mentioned to anyone, something I hadn't written down yet. Just before I had turned back, when the whispers had stopped and the forest had grown deathly quiet, I thought I had seen something carved into the bark of one of the trees. A symbol, faint but unmistakable, etched into the wood as though it had been there for years. It hadn't looked like anything I'd seen before, not a marking from an animal or something left behind by a hiker. It had been deliberate, almost ritualistic, and it sent a chill through me just thinking about it. I sketched it quickly in my notebook, the lines coming easily to mind despite the fatigue weighing on me. 3 interlocking circles, surrounded by jagged lines that almost looked like branches or roots. I stared at the symbol for a long time, the fire crackling softly in the background. Something about it felt familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen it before. Maybe it was just my imagination, working overtime after a long and harrowing night. Or maybe it was something more. I closed the notebook, setting it down on the table, and finally allowed myself to sink into the worn armchair by the fire. Outside, the wind continued to whisper through the trees, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard that same faint voice again, calling from somewhere deep in the forest. Help! I shook my head, dismissing it as fatigue and nerves. But as I sat there, staring into the flickering flames, one thought refused to leave my mind. The forest never forgets. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and with it came another whisper, clearer this time and unmistakably real. We'll be waiting. The fire sputtered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, and for a moment, it felt like the entire forest was leaning in, listening, watching. I sat frozen in place, the chill seeping deeper into my bones. There was no mistaking it now. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done with me, and somehow I knew it never would be. I pressed forward, ignoring the weight of dread clawing at my chest. The fog wrapped tighter around the trees, as if alive, shifting and breathing in tandem with the eerie stillness. The ground beneath my boots felt softer now, as though the earth had given way to something less tangible, less real. Then I saw it again. A faint glow, flickering through the trees, far ahead. Tommy, I called out, though my voice sounded weak, hollow, as if the forest had drained it of strength. The glow didn't move this time, stayed still, waiting. I quickened my pace, the pounding of my heart echoing in my ears. My flashlight flickered once more, the beam dimming with every step closer to that strange, unnatural light. But I didn't stop. The closer I got, the more the air around me changed. It grew colder, far colder than it should have been. The whispers began again, distant at first, but quickly growing louder, surrounding me. They were no longer just faint voices. They were words, fragmented, overlapping, too many to comprehend. And then I emerged into a clearing. The fog parted slightly, revealing the source of the glow. It wasn't a fire, nor a lantern. It was something far more disturbing. A strange, ancient-looking stone altar, worn smooth by time and covered in those same crude symbols I'd seen carved into the trees. The glow emanated from faint lines etched into the surface of the stone, pulsating like a heartbeat. But it wasn't the altar that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the figure standing beside it. Tommy. He stood there, silent and motionless, his red jacket now torn and stained with mud. His eyes, once bright with fear and innocence, were glassy and distant, as if he were in a trance. He didn't look at me, he looked past me, as if seeing something I couldn't. Tommy, I said, taking a cautious step forward. It's okay, I'm here to help you. No response. I took another step, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. The symbols on the altar began to glow brighter, casting an eerie light on the boy's face. I reached out to him, my fingers trembling. As soon as I touched his shoulder, everything changed. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed in on my ears. The glow from the altar faded, and the fog began to swirl violently around us, as though agitated by my presence. Tommy blinked, as if waking from a deep sleep, and turned to look at me. His lips moved, but no sound came out. It's okay, Tommy, I whispered. I'm going to get you out of here. I scooped him up in my arms, his small frame feeling lighter than it should have. He didn't resist. He simply clung to me, his breathing shallow but steady. Without another word, I turned and began retracing my steps, the whispers returning, more distant now, but still present. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move carefully, step by step, keeping my flashlight trained on the path ahead. The fog thickened once more, but this time it felt different. Less hostile, more like it was retreating. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. The forest around me seemed endless, a labyrinth of shadows and mist. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the faint glow of the ranger station's lights through the trees. Relief washed over me as I quickened my pace, stumbling onto the gravel path that led to safety. I carried Tommy through the doors of the station, where the other rangers rushed to meet us. They asked questions, so many questions, but I barely heard them. All that mattered was that we were out. We were safe, or so I thought. As I sat down trying to catch my breath, I glanced at Tommy. He was wrapped in a thermal blanket, sipping hot cocoa, his eyes still distant, haunted by whatever he had seen. But there was something else, something that made my heart skip a beat. On the sleeve of his red jacket, faint but unmistakable, was a symbol. The same symbol I had seen carved into the trees and glowing on the altar. I looked away, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. But deep down, I knew one thing for certain. We had left the forest, but something had followed us out. The sun was just beginning to set over Yellowstone National Park, casting golden light over the Lamar Valley. The vast, open landscape stretched endlessly, a picture of serenity framed by distant mountains. For most visitors, it was a slice of untouched paradise. For me, Danny Clark, it was home, a place I knew better than the lines on my own hands. I was patrolling the trails, radio crackling softly with idle chatter from other rangers, when the call came through. Dispatch to all units. We've got a missing hiker reported near the Lamar Valley. Last known contact was over 8 hours ago. Name's Rachel Summers, female, 27 years old. My hand froze mid-reach for my canteen. 8 hours was bad, real bad. In Yellowstone, 8 hours could mean the difference between finding someone shaken but alive or not finding them at all. I grabbed the radio. This is Ranger Clark. I'm in the area and can respond immediately. Do we have any details on her route? The response was grim. Negative, Clark. No clear trail markers. She was last seen near the Lamar River trailhead but reportedly veered off trail. Solo hiker, inexperienced. Her friend reported her missing after she failed to meet at the rendezvous point. I swore under my breath. Going off trail in Yellowstone was asking for trouble. The wilderness here was beautiful, but it didn't forgive mistakes. By the time I reached the trailhead, twilight had begun to blur the edges of the landscape. Shadows stretched long and thin, twisting the once inviting woods into a tangle of foreboding darkness. My truck's headlights illuminated the small parking area where Rachel's car still sat. A dusty, silver sedan with a live, glass, love bumper sticker. Ranger Clark, Ingvar. I keyed the mic again. Go ahead. Her friend said she mentioned wanting to get a closer look at the wildlife. Be advised, the Lamar Valley is prime grizzly territory this time of year. Understood. Starting my sweep now, I replied, pulling on my pack. My stomach churned. I'd seen the aftermath of hikers who thought they could get close to wildlife. It wasn't pretty. As I began down the trail, I let the rhythm of my boots against the dirt guide my thoughts. Each step carried a weight beyond the physical, the familiar dread that came with every missing person call. The memories of a failed rescue 2 years ago clawed at the edges of my mind. The teenage boy, lost in a snowstorm. We'd found him too late, his bright red jacket barely visible beneath the white drifts. I shook the thought away and focused. This wasn't about the past. Rachel was out there somewhere and she was counting on me. The Lamar Valley was eerily quiet as the last light faded. The distant howl of a wolf broke the silence, sending a shiver down my spine. Normally, I found comfort in the sounds of the wild, but tonight, everything felt off. Even the birds had gone silent. My flashlight beam swept across the trail. Something glinted, a water bottle lying just off the path. I knelt to examine it. A generic plastic bottle, the kind you'd grab at a gas station, with faint smudges of dirt along its sides. Dispatch, I've got a possible item belonging to the missing party, I said into the radio, my voice steady but tight. Copy that, Clark. Mark the location and proceed. I stood, a gnawing sense of urgency quickening my pace. Rachel's path was becoming clearer, but it led directly into the dense forest, a maze of towering pines and tangled underbrush. The trail grew faint, eventually disappearing altogether. I paused, scanning the area. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. It wasn't just the silence or the darkness. It was a feeling, a pressure in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. My flashlight flickered, the beam dancing across the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting between the trunks. I froze, heart pounding. Hello, I called out, my voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. Nothing, just the whisper of the wind through the leaves. I shook it off. The wilderness played tricks on the mind, especially when you were already on edge. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The radio crackled. Clark, update. Still on the trail. Found one item belonging to the hiker, but no visual yet. Proceeding further into the woods. I didn't mention the shadow or the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. The last thing I needed was someone suggesting I was spooking myself. As I pressed deeper into the forest, the darkness seemed to close in tighter. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of trouble Rachel had walked into, and if I was walking into it too. Somewhere in the far distance, a branch snapped, and then silence. The radio crackled in Danny's hand as he stood by the ranger station's weathered map of Yellowstone, the scent of pine heavy in the air. Search and Rescue Team 2 reporting in, a voice announced. No sign of the hiker in the Lamar Valley. Danny exhaled, glancing toward the sprawling wilderness. The Lamar Valley was vast, untamed, and deceptive in its beauty. A patchwork of meadows, winding trails, and dense woods that swallowed the unwary. Rachel Summers, the missing hiker, was somewhere out there, alone against the elements. He wasn't going to let this one end like the last. The team began arriving shortly after sunrise. First was Clara, a veteran ranger with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She dropped her pack with a thud. Looks like you got yourself another wild goose chase, Danny, she said, her tone half joking but tinged with skepticism. Let's hope not, Danny replied, brushing off her remark. Next came Jake, a rookie who looked more at home behind a desk than in the wilderness. His boots were too clean, his gear too new, and the nervous energy radiating from him was almost palpable. First search mission, Jake admitted, his grin too wide to hide his anxiety. Stick close to me, Danny said, clapping him on the shoulder. We'll get through it. Two volunteers rounded out the group. Alex, a wiry man in his 40s with a background in wilderness survival, and Sarah, a nurse who carried herself with quiet determination. Danny appreciated their presence. Their experience and resolve would balance out Jake's inexperience. As they finalized their gear, Danny briefed them. Rachel was last seen near the northern trails of Lamar Valley. Her car's still at the trailhead, but she didn't sign the logbook. That means she might have gone off trail and we've got no idea where or why. We've got to move fast. Weather's clear now, but storms are coming in by tomorrow. With a collective nod, they set out, the early morning sunlight spilling over the valley like molten gold. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, weaving between tall grasses and clusters of sagebrush. Birds chirped overhead, and the distant sound of rushing water echoed through the stillness. For the first hour, the search was methodical and uneventful. The team spread out in a staggered line, scanning for any signs of Rachel. Discarded items, footprints, anything that didn't belong. Clara muttered occasional comments about rookie mistakes and amateur hikers, her voice cutting through the quiet. Then Danny saw it, a water bottle half buried in the dirt near the edge of the trail. He knelt, examining it carefully. The label was partially torn, but the brand matched the one Rachel's family had mentioned she always carried. She was here, Danny said, holding it up. Jake crouched beside him, his eyes wide. Could she have dropped it on accident? Maybe, Danny said, though his gut told him otherwise. The placement was too deliberate, as if it had been left behind, not lost. Clara leaned in, squinting. Trail's too clean. If she wandered off here, we should see more. Broken branches, scuffed dirt. But nothing. Danny frowned. She was right. There was no sign of a struggle or hurried movement, as if Rachel had stepped off the trail and vanished without a trace. As they moved deeper into the valley, the air seemed to change. The cheerful calls of birds faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. The sunlight, once warm and inviting, filtered through the trees in thin, pale streaks, casting long, twisting shadows on the ground. Then they found the markings. At first, they looked like random scratches on the bark of a pine tree, but Danny noticed a pattern: straight, deliberate lines carved deep into the wood. He traced them with his fingers, their edges rough and jagged. The marks didn't match any official trail signs or natural occurrences. What do you think? Sarah asked, her voice quiet. Danny hesitated. Could be nothing, he said, though unease prickled at his skin. Or someone trying to leave a message. Or a warning, Alex added, his tone grim. They pressed on, the markings appearing intermittently, leading them further off the trail. Each one felt like a breadcrumb in a twisted game, pulling them deeper into the unknown. By late afternoon, the sun hung low on the horizon, casting a golden glow that couldn't penetrate the growing sense of unease. Danny called for a halt, deciding they'd set up camp and resume the search at first light. As they pitched their tents and lit a small fire, Clara broke the silence. You feel it, don't you? She said, her voice low. Something's not right. Danny nodded, staring into the flickering flames. He didn't say it aloud, but he felt it too. A creeping dread, as if the wilderness itself was watching, waiting. And somewhere, out there in the growing darkness, Rachel Summers was waiting too. The forest around Lamar Valley was quiet that evening, too quiet. The kind of silence that made Danny's skin crawl. Even the usual chatter of birds and the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush seemed to have vanished. swallowed by the encroaching dusk. His boots crunched against the gravel trail, a jarring sound that only emphasized the unnatural stillness. The radio strapped to his shoulder crackled faintly, a voice from the search team asking for a status update. Danny paused, pulling the device to his mouth. "It's dark here. No sign of Rachel on the southern path. I'm heading deeper into the tree line. Stay on your current grid and report anything unusual." His tone was calm, but his gut told him something was off. As he pressed forward, the air grew heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The trees became denser, their branches weaving together to form a canopy that filtered the fading sunlight into thin, ghostly beams. Danny's flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating patches of ground where moss clung to rocks and twisted roots snaked across the dirt. He moved methodically, scanning for any trace of Rachel, footprints, discarded gear, anything. And then he saw it, a crude marking on the trunk of a tree about chest height. 3 jagged slashes etched into the bark, almost like claw marks. He knelt down, running a gloved finger over the grooves. They weren't made by any animal he knew, too precise, too deliberate. His pulse quickened. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. The forest seemed to respond, the stillness deepening. A faint rustling sound broke the silence, coming from somewhere to his left. Danny froze, his hand instinctively going to the can of bear spray on his belt. The rustling stopped. He turned slowly, his flashlight sweeping over the underbrush. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the oppressive quiet. He exhaled and stood, his nerves on edge. Maybe it was just a squirrel or the wind, though neither explanation felt convincing. He marked the tree's location on his GPS and continued forward, his eyes scanning the ground for any other clues. As he moved deeper into the forest, the unease grew. He could feel it like a weight pressing against his chest. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, a primal instinct screaming that he wasn't alone. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement. He whipped his flashlight around, the beam landing on a figure standing about 30 yards away. The light barely illuminated the man, who was half hidden behind a tree. His features were obscured by the distance and the play of shadows, but Danny could make out enough. A tall, lean build, dark clothing, and a face that seemed to melt into the darkness. "Hey!" Danny called out, his voice echoing in the still air. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move, didn't answer. He just stood there watching. Danny's grip tightened on the flashlight. He took a cautious step forward. "This is a restricted area. You're not supposed to be here. Identify yourself." Still no response. The man shifted slightly, leaning further into the shadows, as if taunting him. Something about the figure felt wrong, predatory. Danny wasn't a man prone to panic, but his instincts were screaming at him to back away. He reached for his radio with his free hand, his eyes never leaving the stranger. "This is Clark," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I've got a possible unauthorized individual near Grid 7, requesting backup." The figure moved fast. One moment, it was there, and the next, it had melted into the forest, swallowed by the darkness. Danny's flashlight darted after it, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. "Damn it," he muttered, his heart pounding. He scanned the area, listening intently for any sign of movement. The forest was silent again, as if the encounter had never happened. Danny stayed there for a long moment, his senses straining. Whoever that was, they were good, too good. He didn't hear footsteps, didn't see any broken branches or signs of movement. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. He hesitated, debating whether to pursue the figure or return to the team. Logic told him to regroup, but his gut pushed him forward. Rachel was still out there, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the man he'd just seen had something to do with her disappearance. Switching off his flashlight to preserve his night vision, Danny pressed deeper into the forest, his every step deliberate and quiet. The shadows seemed to close in around him, the darkness feeling alive, watching. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of his senses, Danny felt it again. The presence of eyes on him, unblinking and relentless. The storm arrived as if summoned by an unseen force, sudden and unrelenting. Thick clouds rolled in over the Lamar Valley, blotting out the sun and plunging the forest into a premature twilight. The wind howled through the trees, bending the tallest pines until they creaked under the strain. Rain began to pelt down in cold, stinging sheets, turning the dirt trails into slick, treacherous muck. Danny Clark stood at the edge of a rocky outcrop, scanning the horizon with his binoculars. His rain-soaked jacket clung to him, and the chill seeped into his bones, but he didn't care. His eyes were fixed on the distant ridges, searching for any trace of Rachel Summers. His gut told him she was still out there, alive, but he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that time was slipping away. Behind him, the search team huddled under a tarp hastily strung between two trees. The group's earlier camaraderie had dissolved into a tense silence, punctuated only by the occasional curse as someone slipped in the mud or wrung out a drenched jacket. The youngest member of the team, rookie ranger Jason, was trying to light a fire, but the rain smothered every spark before it could catch. "Danny, we can't keep this up," called out Maggie, a seasoned ranger and Danny's second in command. Her voice was barely audible over the wind. "The storm's only getting worse. We should head back to base and regroup." Danny lowered his binoculars and turned to face her. Maggie's face was drawn, her usually sharp eyes dull with exhaustion. She was right. They were all cold, tired, and dangerously close to losing their focus. But something inside Danny wouldn't let him quit. "Not yet. She's out there, Maggie," Danny said, his voice firm despite the doubts creeping into his own mind. "Every hour we waste could mean the difference between life and death." Maggie sighed, her shoulders slumping. "And if we lose one of our own out here, then what?" Before Danny could respond, Jason let out a triumphant shout. "Got it." He held up a flickering flame, protected by his cupped hands. For a moment, the team gathered around, their faces illuminated by the small, fragile light. It wasn't much, but it was enough to lift their spirits, if only slightly. As they warmed their hands by the fire, Danny took the opportunity to study the map. He traced the last known coordinates of Rachel's route and the areas they had already covered. Something wasn't adding up. The markings they'd found earlier, the strange symbols carved into trees, weren't official trail markers. They seemed to lead in erratic directions, often doubling back on themselves. Danny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. The rain eventually eased to a steady drizzle, and the team pressed on, navigating the slippery trails with caution. The forest seemed to close in around them, the towering pines and thick underbrush creating a sense of suffocating isolation. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves set them on edge. Then they found it. The campsite appeared out of nowhere, just off the main trail. At first glance, it seemed abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. The tent was half collapsed, its fabric torn in long, jagged lines. A burnt-out fire pit sat at the center, its ashes scattered by the wind. Scattered around the site were belongings. In the outer bottom, a single hiking boot, a crumpled map, but they were arranged in a way that didn't make sense, as if someone had deliberately placed them there to mislead. Danny crouched by the fire pit, picking up a charred piece of wood. It was cold, far too cold to have been used recently. He glanced at Maggie, who was examining the torn tent with a grim expression. "This isn't normal," she said quietly. "Even if Rachel was panicked, this doesn't look like her trying to set up camp. It looks staged." Danny nodded, his mind racing. He was about to speak when Jason called out from the edge of the clearing. Guys, you might want to see this." They hurried over to find Jason standing by a tree, his flashlight trained on something carved into the bark. It was one of the strange symbols they'd seen earlier, a crude, angular shape that looked like a combination of a triangle and a spiral. But this one was different, freshly carved. The bark was still raw, the edges damp from the rain. Danny felt his pulse quicken. Someone had been here, recently. "We're not alone out here," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. As night fell, the team reluctantly set up camp nearby. No one wanted to stay, but the storm had drained their energy, and navigating the trails in the dark was too risky. Danny took the first watch, sitting by the fire with his flashlight resting on his lap. The others huddled in their tents, their exhaustion finally overtaking their fear. The forest was eerily quiet. Even the usual sounds of nocturnal animals seemed absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Danny's eyes darted from shadow to shadow, every flicker of the firelight making him jump. He thought back to the figure he'd seen earlier, the one watching him from the trees. Was it the same person who had left those strange markings? The same person who had sabotaged the campsite? A sudden snap of a branch made him freeze. He gripped his flashlight tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly, he turned toward the sound, his beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the breeze. But then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, he saw it. A shape, tall and motionless, blending into the shadows. His breath caught in his throat as the figure shifted slightly, just enough to reveal the glint of pale eyes watching him. Danny didn't move. He didn't dare. But in that moment, he knew one thing for certain. They were being hunted. The path was treacherous, even for someone as experienced as me. My boots sank into the soft, rain-soaked earth with each step, the storm having turned the once firm trail into a slick, muddy mess. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the mournful creak of branches swaying under its relentless force. The air was dense, heavy with the smell of wet pine and the metallic tang of an impending chill. Every noise, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves, felt amplified in the oppressive quiet that followed the storm's passing. Our group had grown eerily silent. Fatigue was etched into everyone's faces. Their shoulders slumped under the weight of their gear and the tension that had settled over us like a suffocating fog. The only sound was the steady crunch of boots on gravel and the occasional hiss of static from our radios. Even the birds, usually bold and noisy in these woods, seemed to sense that something wasn't right. "Wait," said Greg, one of the younger rangers. His voice was barely a whisper, his eyes darting toward the thick line of trees to our right. "Did you see that?" We all stopped, the sudden stillness sending a shiver up my spine. My hand instinctively went to the bear spray strapped to my belt. I followed Greg's gaze, scanning the dense shadows, but saw nothing except the shifting silhouettes of trees in the dim, gray light. "See what?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "There was someone," Greg stammered. His face had gone pale, and his breath came in shallow, rapid bursts. "I swear I saw someone, just standing there." "Probably your mind playing tricks on you," muttered Alan, the oldest and most skeptical member of our team. He adjusted his wide-brimmed hat, squinting into the trees. "This place will do that to you if you're not careful." But I wasn't so sure. Greg wasn't the type to spook easily, and the nagging feeling that we weren't alone had been gnawing at me for hours. As we pressed on, the landscape began to change. The towering pines gave way to gnarled, twisted trees with skeletal branches that clawed at the sky. The trail markers, simple wooden posts we relied on to guide us, were suddenly sparse, then disappeared altogether. My stomach twisted into a knot as I realized we were no longer on the designated trail. It was Alan who found the first sign. "Over here," he called, his voice tight. We gathered around him, our flashlights illuminating what looked like a deliberate arrangement of sticks and stones on the ground. It was crude but unmistakably human. Arrows pointed deeper into the woods, their angles sharp and jagged, almost aggressive. "Trail markers?" Greg asked, though his voice betrayed doubt. "Not ours," I said, kneeling to inspect them. The arrangement was too haphazard, too makeshift to be anything official. But it wasn't random either. Someone had placed these here, though their intentions weren't clear. Could be Rachel trying to lead us to her? Dallin offered, though he didn't sound convinced. Or someone trying to lead us away. I muttered under my breath. The forest seemed to close in on us as we followed the crude markers. The trees pressing closer, their branches intertwining like the bars of a cage. The air grew colder, and a faint, almost imperceptible sound began to rise above the crunch of our boots. A low, rhythmic tapping, like knuckles rapping against wood. "Do you hear that?" whispered Sarah, one of the volunteers. I nodded, my hand tightening on the flashlight. The tapping was distant but deliberate, echoing faintly through the trees. It stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an uneasy silence in its wake. When we reached the end of the trail, we found ourselves standing at the mouth of a narrow canyon. The walls were jagged and steep, their surfaces slick with moss and rainwater. At the base of the canyon, a cluster of rocks and fallen trees formed a natural barricade, as though nature itself had tried to keep people out. "This doesn't feel right," Greg said, his voice trembling. "Stay alert," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. As we descended into the canyon, the sense of wrongness only deepened. The markers had led us here deliberately, but to what end? I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My flashlight swept over the canyon walls, the beam flickering as though reluctant to reveal what lay ahead. Then we saw it. A small, tattered piece of fabric caught on a jagged rock. It flapped weakly in the breeze, its once bright color dulled by dirt and rain. I stepped forward, my heart pounding as I reached out to grab it. The moment my fingers closed around the fabric, the tapping started again. Louder this time, closer. "Danny," Sarah whispered, her voice sharp with fear. I turned, my flashlight catching a glimpse of movement at the edge of the canyon. A figure stood there, shrouded in shadow, its features indistinguishable. It didn't move, didn't make a sound beyond the rhythmic tapping. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. The figure didn't respond. It simply turned and melted into the trees, leaving us alone with the tapping and the growing sense that we had wandered into something far more dangerous than we'd anticipated. The first rays of sunlight broke through the dense canopy, painting the forest floor in dappled patches of gold. The storm from the previous night had left the air thick and humid, the ground soft underfoot. Danny tightened the straps of his pack and adjusted his radio, though he knew there was little hope of contact. The deeper they ventured into Lamar Valley, the less reliable technology became. The wilderness was swallowing them whole, and with every step, Danny felt the weight of Rachel's absence pressing harder on his chest. The team was silent this morning, their banter from days earlier replaced by the heavy tension of unanswered questions. The discovery of the disturbed campsite and the eerie noises from the night before had left a scar on their confidence. Danny's instincts screamed that something or someone was toying with them. The unease was infectious, spreading through the group like wildfire. As the team fanned out along the trail, Danny's sharp eyes caught a glint of something out of place. A shred of fabric, bright against the earth tones of the forest, fluttered from a low-hanging branch. He knelt and plucked it free, his stomach tightening as he examined the torn piece. It was lightweight, synthetic, and unmistakably part of a hiking jacket. "Rachel," he murmured under his breath, feeling a spark of hope ignite. "Danny, what is it?" called Linda, the team's field medic, as she approached. "Piece of her jacket," he replied, holding it up for her to see. The others gathered around, their expressions shifting from weariness to cautious optimism. But Danny's hope was short-lived. Just below the branch, carved into the bark in jagged, uneven letters, was a chilling message. "Don't trust him." The group froze as they read the words. "What the hell does that mean?" asked Mark, one of the younger rangers, his voice trembling slightly. Danny's jaw tightened. "It means we're not alone out here," The team pressed onward, the atmosphere heavy with unease. Danny's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. Rachel was alive long enough to leave this warning. Of that he was certain. But who was him? His thoughts wandered back to the shadowy figure he had seen, the one no one else seemed to take seriously. Every instinct in his body told him that man was behind this. The trail grew narrower, the forest denser. Fallen logs and thick undergrowth slowed their progress. Then, just as Danny stepped over a tangle of roots, he noticed something else. A footprint, barely visible in the mud. He crouched to examine it. The print was deep, too large for Rachel and fresh. "Someone's been through here recently," he said, pointing it out to the group. "Could it be her?" Linda asked. Danny shook his head. "Too big. It's a man's footprint. Maybe it's a search volunteer from another sector?" Mark offered, though the uncertainty in his voice was palpable. "No," Danny replied firmly. "We're the only team assigned to this area." As they continued, the forest seemed to grow darker, the light struggling to penetrate the thick canopy. A palpable sense of wrongness settled over them. Then came the sound, faint at first, almost imperceptible, a rhythmic tapping like the soft knock of wood against wood. Danny stopped, raising a hand to silence the group. The tapping continued, irregular but deliberate, coming from somewhere ahead. "What is that?" Linda whispered. Danny didn't answer. He motioned for the group to stay put and crept forward, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. The sound grew louder as he approached a small clearing. There, hanging from a low branch, was a crude wind chime made of bones and sticks, swaying gently in the breeze. Danny's breath caught. The sight was grotesque and deeply unsettling. The bones were small, animal, he hoped, but the way they were arranged, the deliberate craftsmanship, sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't the work of nature. Someone had made this. Someone who wanted to send a message. "What the hell is that?" Linda asked, her voice startlingly close. The rest of the group had ignored his order to stay back and now stood behind him, their faces pale with fear. "A warning," Danny said grimly, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the clearing. "Or a threat." The team decided to press on despite their mounting fear. But Danny couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set his nerves on edge. He tried to focus on the task at hand, finding Rachel, but the forest seemed to conspire against him, twisting and turning as if to confuse their path. Hours passed before they stumbled upon another sign. A small pile of rocks stacked in a deliberate formation. Beneath it, they found a torn page from a journal, the ink smudged but still legible. "He's always watching. Don't let him find you." Danny clenched the page in his fist. Whoever he was toying with them, leading them deeper into the woods and further from safety. And yet, Danny felt a surge of resolve. He wouldn't let this unseen figure win. Rachel was out there, and he would find her, no matter what it took. As the day gave way to evening, the group set up camp, their nerves frayed but their determination intact. Danny sat by the fire, the torn fabric and journal page in his lap. He stared into the flames, his mind a storm of questions. The forest around them seemed to breathe, the shadows shifting and stretching like living things. Somewhere in the distance, the faint tapping began again. Danny's hand tightened around his knife. Whatever was out there, he knew it wouldn't let them leave easily. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows across the dense pines as I pushed deeper into the Lamar Valley. My boots crunched against the undergrowth, each step echoing in the eerie stillness. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine resin, but it felt oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I had left the team behind at the last checkpoint, insisting I scout ahead. There was something here. I could feel it, a whispering presence, a tug at the edge of my instincts that I couldn't ignore. Rachel's torn fabric, her desperate warning scribbled in haste, haunted my thoughts. Don't trust him. But who was him? Was it a figment of her fear or something far worse? As I crested a small ridge, the landscape opened into a clearing, a patch of open ground nestled like a scar in the heart of the forest. The trees around it seemed taller, darker, their branches clawing at the twilight sky. In the center stood a figure. At first glance, he could have been mistaken for another ranger. His stance casual, hands resting at his sides, but something about him was wrong. He didn't move, didn't shift his weight like a normal person. He simply stood there, as if he had been waiting for me. Lost Ranger. The voice was smooth, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it, like the whisper of a blade against stone. I froze, every nerve on edge. My hand instinctively rested on the radio clipped to my vest, though I knew the others were too far to help. The man stepped forward, and the dying light caught his features. A weathered face, sharp and angular, with eyes that gleamed unnaturally, reflecting the dim light like a predator's. "I'm looking for Rachel Summers," I said, keeping my voice steady. My other hand hovered near the knife strapped to my belt. "Have you seen her?" His lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile you'd see on someone who knew more than they should. "Rachel," he mused, drawing the name out as if tasting it. "Yes, I've seen her. She's safe for now." My stomach clenched. "Where is she?" He took another step closer, his boots making no sound against the ground. "You're asking the wrong questions, Ranger. You should be asking why she's here in the first place. What brought her to my woods?" "Your woods," I repeated, my voice tinged with disbelief. "This is Yellowstone. It belongs to everyone." The man chuckled, a now humorless sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Does it? Funny how everyone thinks they own what they don't understand." He gestured broadly to the forest around us. "You think you know this place, but you don't. Not really. You see the trails, the campsites, the brochures. You don't see what's underneath." "Enough with the cryptic nonsense," I snapped, my frustration overriding my fear. "If you know where Rachel is, tell me." His smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard stare. "She wandered where she shouldn't have, and now you're doing the same. Turn around, Ranger. Go back to your team and forget you ever saw me." Something in his tone, calm but edged with menace, told me he wasn't bluffing. But I couldn't leave. Not without Rachel. "I'm not leaving without her," I said firmly, stepping forward despite the knot tightening in my chest. "If you know where she is, you're going to take me to her." For a moment, the man said nothing. His expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Anger, maybe, or pity. "You're brave, I'll give you that," he said at last. "But bravery won't save you out here." He turned as if to leave, his movements unnaturally smooth, almost inhuman. Panic surged in me. If he disappeared now, I might never find Rachel. "Wait," I called after him, my voice echoing across the clearing. He stopped but didn't turn around. "One last warning, Ranger," he said, his voice low and deadly. "Some things are better left alone. Keep searching and you'll wish you hadn't." And then he was gone, slipping into the shadows as if the forest had swallowed him whole. I ran after him, but there was no sign of his passage. No broken branches, no disturbed undergrowth. It was as if he had never been there at all. I stood alone in the clearing, the weight of his words pressing down on me. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to call for reinforcements, but I knew I couldn't. Rachel was still out there, and now I was certain someone or something didn't want her to be found. As darkness fell over the forest, I tightened my grip on my knife and took a deep breath. Whatever lay ahead, I had to face it. There was no turning back now. The air inside the cave was suffocating, thick with the mingling sense of damp earth and decay. My flashlight beam trembled as it swept across the jagged walls. revealing claw-like shadows that danced in the flickering light. Deep within the cavern, I found her, Rachel Summers. She was slumped against the cold stone, her face pale, her lips cracked and trembling. Her clothes were torn and muddied, and her eyes darted wildly toward the light, her expression teetering between relief and terror. You found me," she croaked, her voice barely audible over the distant drip of water echoing through the cave. I crouched beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," I whispered, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. My heart thundered in my chest, and every instinct screamed that we weren't alone. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly but didn't move. Her hands gripped my arm like a lifeline. "He's still out there," she rasped. "He'll find us." My grip on the flashlight tightened. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Her eyes darted toward the cave's entrance. "The man, he said I'd never leave." Chills prickled down my spine. I reached into my pack, pulling out a water bottle and pressing it into her hands. "Drink this," I said. "We'll get out together. Promise." As Rachel drank in desperate gulps, I scanned the cave for any sign of the man she spoke of, the shadow. He had been toying with us for days, but now the game was escalating. I could feel it in the oppressive silence that seemed to press down on us like a weight. When Rachel finally stood, her legs wobbled beneath her. I looped her arm over my shoulder, supporting her as we made our way toward the faint sliver of light marking the cave's exit. Every step echoed, a sound that seemed far too loud in the suffocating darkness. We didn't make it far before I heard it, a low, deliberate sound, like the scrape of a boot against stone. I froze, my flashlight swinging wildly toward the noise. There, at the edge of the beam, I saw him. The shadow stood motionless, his face obscured by the brim of a battered hat. His silhouette was larger than I remembered, his presence filling the narrow passage like a living nightmare. "I told you to leave it alone," he said, his voice as cold and unyielding as the stone around us. "Now you've made this worse for both of you," Rachel whimpered, her grip on my arm tightening. I shifted, placing myself between her and the man. "Get out of our way," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. He didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head, studying us like a predator assessing its prey. "She shouldn't have come here," he said, almost to himself. "And you should have listened." Before I could respond, he lunged. The confined space erupted into chaos. I shoved Rachel behind me and swung my flashlight, its heavy metal casing connecting with his arm. He staggered but didn't retreat, his hands clawing toward me with unsettling strength. I kicked out, aiming for his knee, and felt a sickening crunch as he faltered, falling to one side. "Run," I shouted to Rachel. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before stumbling toward the cave's exit, her figure disappearing into the gray light of the outside world. I turned to follow, but the shadow grabbed my ankle, dragging me down. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering uselessly against the stone. I kicked furiously, my boot connecting with his chest. He grunted, releasing me just long enough for me to scramble to my feet. Without thinking, I grabbed the flashlight and swung it again, this time aiming for his head. The impact sent him sprawling, and I didn't wait to see if he would get back up. I bolted for the exit, my lungs burning as I burst into the open air. Rachel was ahead of me, limping toward the tree line. I caught up to her and grabbed her arm, pulling her into the dense cover of the forest. "We need to keep moving," I panted, glancing over my shoulder. The cave entrance loomed behind us, but there was no sign of him. Not yet. The forest was alive with sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a raven. But all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. We didn't stop until we reached a clearing, where I collapsed against a tree, Rachel crumpling beside me. "We can't stay here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He'll find us." I nodded, my mind racing. The radio was in my pack, but the signal in this part of the park was spotty at best. I pulled it out anyway, pressing the button with shaking fingers. "This is Ranger Clark," I said. "I found Rachel Summers. Request immediate extraction." Static crackled in response, but no voice came through. Rachel looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "What now?" I stared into the shadowy depths of the forest, where every movement felt like a threat. "We keep moving," I said, my voice hardening. "We don't stop until we're out of his reach." And so, with every muscle screaming in protest and every nerve on edge, we pushed forward, the shadow of our pursuer always just behind us. The forest was alive with the sounds of night, branches groaning under a stiff wind, distant howls of wolves, and the faint trickle of water from an unseen stream. Danny's breathing was shallow, controlled, as he knelt behind a fallen log, his hand gripping the hilt of his knife. Rachel crouched beside him, trembling but silent, her wide eyes darting between Danny and the shadows shifting in the darkness beyond. "We have to keep moving," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. Danny shook his head, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line. "Not yet. He's out there, watching. The shadow." That's what Danny had begun calling him in his mind, though he doubted the man deserved even that much humanity. This wasn't just a predator stalking prey, this was a game. A calculated, cruel game. Danny had seen the look in the man's eyes back at the cave. There was no pity, no remorse, just cold purpose. Danny motioned for Rachel to stay low as he peered over the log. The darkness seemed to pulse, the shadows shifting unnaturally, as if the forest itself was conspiring to hide their pursuer. And then, there, a glint of something, moonlight catching on metal, the barrel of a rifle. "He's armed," Danny whispered, his voice tight. His mind raced. The odds were bad. Danny had a knife and a dying flashlight. Rachel could barely stand, much less run. But he knew the terrain, and that would have to be enough. "Rachel," he said, turning to her, his voice low but firm. "Do you trust me?" She hesitated, her lip quivering, before nodding. "Good. When I say go, you run. Follow the ridge down to the stream. Stay low, stay quiet. Don't stop until you reach the clearing. I'll catch up." Her eyes widened. "What about you?" "I'll buy you time." "No, Danny." "Rachel." He cut her off, his voice edged with a desperation he rarely let show. "This is our only chance. Do you understand me? You have to trust me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded again, clutching the torn fabric of her jacket as if it were a lifeline. Danny counted the seconds in his head, listening to the faint crunch of leaves and snapping twigs that signaled the shadow's approach. The man was methodical, deliberate. He wanted them to feel hunted. At the count of 3, Danny tapped Rachel's arm. "Dow," she bolted, her figure disappearing into the underbrush. The shadow must have heard her. There was a pause in the steps, followed by a soft, guttural chuckle. Danny stood, deliberately stepping into the open. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice echoing through the trees. "Looking for me?" A shot rang out, the crack of the rifle splitting the night. The bullet struck a tree inches from Danny's head, showering him with splinters. He dove behind a boulder, his heart pounding but his mind sharp. The shadow was closer now, moving with the precision of a predator closing in on its kill. Danny could hear his boots crunching on the frostbitten ground, could smell the faint metallic tang of sweat and gunpowder. "Brave, aren't you?" The shadow's voice called out, low and mocking. "But brave don't mean smart." Danny didn't reply. Instead, he moved quickly and silently, circling back toward the ridge where he knew Rachel would be descending. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his last resort, a flare. It wasn't much, but it could buy him the distraction he needed. The footsteps were closer now. Danny waited until he could see the faint outline of the man's figure, a dark silhouette against the pale bark of the trees. He struck the flare, its red light blazing to life and casting eerie shadows around the forest. The shadow recoiled, blinded for a moment. Danny used the opportunity to close the distance, lunging forward and slamming his shoulder into the man's chest. The rifle clattered to the ground as the two men tumbled into the dirt, a tangle of limbs and raw aggression. The shadow was stronger than Danny had expected, his movements quick and brutal. Danny fought with everything he had, using his knife to fend off the man's strikes. The blade sliced through fabric, drawing a grunt of pain, but it wasn't enough to stop him. The two struggled in the dirt, the forest echoing with their grunts and the scrape of metal against rock. The shadow gained the upper hand, pinning Danny to the ground, his hands closing around Danny's throat. Danny's vision blurred, his lungs burning for air. Desperation fueled him, and he reached for the flare still burning in the dirt beside him. With the last of his strength, he grabbed it and drove it into the man's side. The shadow howled, releasing Danny as he staggered back, clutching his ribs. The smell of burnt fabric and flesh filled the air. Danny scrambled to his feet, grabbing the rifle and aiming it at the man, but the shadow was gone. He melted into the forest as if he'd never been there, leaving Danny gasping for breath and clutching the weapon like a lifeline. The forest was silent again, save for Danny's ragged breathing. He didn't waste time, he had to find Rachel. When Danny reached the clearing, Rachel was there, huddled against a tree, her face streaked with tears. Relief flooded through him as he dropped to his knees beside her. "It's over," she lied, pulling her into a protective embrace. But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't over. Not yet. The shadow was still out there watching, waiting. And Danny had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. The summer sun hung low over Yellowstone, casting long shadows across the Lamar Valley as I made my way down a familiar trail. Weeks had passed since Rachel Summers was airlifted to safety, but the events of those harrowing days lingered in my mind like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. Officially, the case was closed. Rachel was alive, the search was deemed a success, and the park's visitors continued to marvel at its untouched beauty, blissfully unaware of the darkness that still lurked within. But I couldn't let it go. I told myself it was routine, just another patrol to check for signs of wildlife or maintenance issues. Deep down, I knew the truth. Something had brought me back here, an itch under my skin, a gnawing feeling that wouldn't let me rest. The shadow was still out there, and the forest wasn't finished with me. The Lamar Valley was unusually quiet. The usual chatter of birds and rustling of undergrowth seemed muffled, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. My boots crunched against the gravel paths, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. Every now and then, a branch snapped in the distance, but when I turned, there was nothing, just the dense, towering trees, their canopies filtering the waning sunlight into ghostly beams. The air grew colder as I approached the area where we'd found Rachel's torn fabric, and the cryptic warning, "Don't trust him," felt different now, as if the ground remembered. I stopped by the tree where the fabric had been tangled, running my hand over the bark. The grooves of the warning had been etched deep, not just by human hands, but as if the tree itself had absorbed the fear Rachel must have felt. And then, I felt it, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, scanning the forest, my hand instinctively hovering over the bear spray clipped to my belt. The underbrush swayed faintly, though there was no wind. I strained my ears, catching the faintest shuffle of footsteps. Deliberate, calculated. The same pattern I'd heard that night weeks ago. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to remain still, blending into the scenery. "You're wasting your time," a voice murmured, low and gravelly, yet unmistakably human. I whipped around, and there he was, the shadow. He stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by a pine tree, his figure almost blending into the dim light. He was tall and lean, his clothing a patchwork of earth tones that made him seem like part of the forest itself. His face was gaunt, his eyes sharp and predatory, and his lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "You should have left well enough alone," he said, his voice carrying through the stillness. Adrenaline surged through me, but I kept my voice steady. "What do you want?" I demanded. "Why were you out here? What did Rachel stumble into?" He chuckled softly, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "She saw something she shouldn't have. That's all you need to know. And you're too curious for your own good." "You're not scaring me," I lied. My hand tightened around the bear spray, though I knew it was a feeble defense against a man who knew these woods better than anyone. The shadow stepped closer, the dappled sunlight catching his face for the first time. His skin was weathered, his eyes hollow but alight with a strange intensity, like a man who'd spent too much time with his own demons. "Scaring you isn't the point," he said softly. "It's keeping the balance." "The balance?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. "What the hell are you talking about?" He tilted his head, studying me like a predator deciding whether to pounce. "You think Yellowstone belongs to people like you, rangers, tourists, governments, but it doesn't. It belongs to those who understand it, and those who protect its secrets." I took a step forward, emboldened by anger. "You endangered a woman's life for some twisted notion of protection. You think that makes you noble?" His expression darkened, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something human, regret, maybe, or guilt. "I didn't hurt her. I just made sure she couldn't hurt the park. People like her come here and think it's a playground, but they don't see what's underneath." "What's underneath?" I pressed. "What are you hiding?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and disappeared into the trees with a grace that seemed unnatural, his footsteps fading into the distance. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The forest seemed to exhale, the stillness breaking with the rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. I should have called for backup. I should have reported him, but I didn't. Something about his words, his presence, held me back. When I finally returned to the ranger station that evening, I filed my usual patrol report. Routine, uneventful, nothing to note. But as I signed my name at the bottom, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. Even now, when I walk the trails, I feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. The shadow may have disappeared into Yellowstone's vast expanse, but his warning lingers in my mind like an echo. Some things are meant to stay hidden, and maybe, just maybe, I'd already seen too much.